Greg Harris wasn't used to surprises. He liked his days predictable. Morning coffee at 7:30, the constant hum of the dealership, the sound of keys clicking on his computer as he processed customer requests, and, of course, the endless, mechanical grind of car sales. That was his life for the past 12 years, and frankly, he was okay with it. He wasn't chasing excitement anymore. Not after the divorce, the lonely nights spent staring at his phone, wishing his teenage son would call. No, Greg's world was best suited to the steady rhythm of routine. But that evening, as the clock ticked closer to closing time, something strange happened. It started with the sound of tires crunching on the gravel parking lot outside. Greg glanced up from his desk, his eyes narrowing. The dealership was just about to close for the night. No one ever came in this late. Maybe it was another guy who'd forgotten something. Then the door creaked open. Greg didn't look up at first. He was finishing a quick email, trying to wrap up the last of his work for the day. But when he heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and confident, he couldn't ignore them. He glanced up, fully expecting to see someone with a confused look on their face, asking about a car they'd seen earlier that day. But instead, there was a man standing in front of him, wearing a simple black hoodie and jeans. He was tall, really tall, and there was something about the way he held himself, the way his gaze scanned the showroom, that made Greg's heart skip a beat. The man took a few steps into the dealership, his eyes lighting up as they locked onto a shiny, midnight blue sports car on the far end of the showroom floor. Greg's mind began to work quickly. Maybe it was another rich customer, someone with too much money and not enough taste. He'd seen his fair share of them. Greg pushed his chair back, clearing his throat. "Can I help you, sir?" The man turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Greg's. There was something oddly familiar about him, something Greg couldn't quite place. But he was too busy to focus on it. "Yeah," the man said, his voice low, calm. "I'd like to take that car for a test drive." Greg raised an eyebrow. "The Shelby GT 500? I'm not sure if we're doing test drives this late. I can schedule one for tomorrow, though." The man smiled. It wasn't a typical smile. It was more of a knowing smirk. "I'm not sure I'll be around tomorrow." Greg shifted in his chair, glancing at the clock. Closing time was a few minutes away. "Listen, we really don't." Before he could finish, the man took another step toward the car, his attention still fixed on it. It wasn't lost on Greg that the man didn't seem to care about the usual procedures. He seemed entitled, almost arrogantly so. Greg let out a breath, irritated. "Look, if you're here to waste my time." The man's eyes suddenly narrowed. His tone grew colder. "Excuse me?" Greg caught himself, clearing his throat again. "I mean, I can't just let you walk in here and demand a test drive. This isn't a playground. We've got rules." The man stopped in his tracks, staring at Greg. There was a brief moment of silence. Greg didn't back down. He had dealt with rude, entitled customers before. This was just another one. The sooner he got rid of this guy, the better. "Is there something you don't understand?" Greg added, already growing tired of the interaction. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave Greg a quick glance, his lips parting slightly as if weighing something, before, to Greg's surprise, the man turned on his heel and began walking back toward the door. Greg sat there, half watching, half relieved that the man had finally decided to leave. It wasn't until the man reached the door that Greg heard him speak again. "I was going to buy a fleet of cars, but I guess I'll go somewhere else." Greg's brain froze for a split second. He didn't recognize the man, but something about that statement hit him hard. A fleet of cars? Did this guy think he was some sort of billionaire? He had to be bluffing. Before Greg could respond, the man paused in the doorway. "You're the manager, aren't you?" Greg narrowed his eyes. "I am, but that's not." The man interrupted. "Just know, I could have bought a lot of cars from this dealership. Maybe I still will. But the way you treat people? Not great." Greg's stomach churned slightly. Something about the way the man spoke made him second-guess everything. But, before he could say another word, the man left. As the door clicked shut behind him, Greg sat back in his chair, feeling a mix of confusion and frustration. Who was that? What was his deal? Trying to shake off the encounter, Greg turned to lock the office door and head out, but the unease lingered. The following morning, the dealership was buzzing with activity. Greg entered the building with his usual routine: grab coffee, catch up with the staff, and prepare for another day of selling cars. His mind, however, kept circling back to the man from last night. It didn't help that one of the junior salespeople approached him with an urgent look in her eyes. "Greg, you won't believe it. The big news: Michael Jordan just bought the dealership." Greg blinked, his coffee halfway to his mouth. "Michael Jordan? The basketball player?" She nodded eagerly. "Yeah, the one and only. Word is, he's planning some big changes." Greg stared blankly, his mind scrambling to process the information. The man from last night? Michael Jordan? It couldn't be, but it had to be. His pulse quickened, and his face flushed with a sudden rush of embarrassment. Greg had no idea how to face Michael Jordan now. How could he have kicked out one of the wealthiest men in the world, not even realizing who he was? As he tried to process the situation, he couldn't shake the realization. He might have just ruined his career without even knowing it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Greg Harris was the kind of guy who never asked for much. He didn't crave fame, excitement, or a life of luxury. In fact, he had learned the hard way that those things only brought complications. A steady job, a routine, and a quiet life. That was all he really wanted. Yet, even the simplest life could be difficult when the past still had a way of creeping up on you. Greg had grown up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. His parents were hardworking, middle-class people, content with their simple lives. They had raised Greg to value stability, to work hard, and to never dream too big. He had followed that advice faithfully, getting a job at the local dealership right after high school. It was supposed to be a stepping stone to something bigger, but somehow, Greg never found himself leaving. He had married young, hoping for the picture-perfect life he'd been taught to strive for. For a while, things were good. He had a beautiful wife, a son on the way, and a job that paid the bills. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and Greg didn't handle them well. The first real test came when his son, Luke, was born. A premature birth that led to months of hospital visits, sleepless nights, and constant stress. Greg threw himself into work during this time, telling himself that providing for his family was the only way to keep things together. But it wasn't enough. His wife, Sarah, had wanted him to be there more. She needed his support, his presence, and his attention. But Greg was consumed by the dealership, by the grind of selling cars, fixing problems, and making sure the bills were paid. He didn't realize it then, but his absence was slowly eroding his marriage. Eventually, Sarah left. She took Luke with her, and Greg was left to pick up the pieces of a broken life. He still saw his son on weekends, but the visits were strained. Luke was growing up without him, and Greg could feel the gap widening between them. He knew that his workaholism had driven Sarah away, but he couldn't bring himself to change. The fear of failure, of not being able to provide for his family, had kept him locked in a cycle of overwork and loneliness. That's how Greg found himself sitting at a desk in a car dealership that had long ago stopped feeling like a stepping stone. It felt more like a cage, a place where dreams went to die. He had moved up in the company, eventually becoming the manager, but the promotion had done little to alleviate the feelings of dissatisfaction that weighed on him. He was stuck, coasting through life, making just enough money to get by. The dealership had its ups and downs, but it was predictable. The customers, the sales, the drama, everything followed a rhythm that Greg could rely on. That predictability was his refuge. But now, his routine was beginning to unravel. He had heard whispers about the dealership being sold, but it had never felt real, just another rumor that would eventually fade. The rumors about a new owner didn't faze him. After all, every few years, there were talks of changes. But now, with Michael Jordan's name thrown into the mix, it felt like things were about to change in a way that Greg hadn't prepared for. He leaned back in his chair, trying to push away the nagging feeling in his gut. The new owner, Michael Jordan. It didn't make sense. Why would someone like that be interested in a small-town car dealership? As Greg stared out the window of his office, his thoughts drifted back to the days when life seemed simpler. Back to the days when he had a family, a wife who cared, a son who needed him, and a future he had been working toward. That future now felt like a distant dream. He had lost so much along the way. But maybe, just maybe, this new owner, Michael Jordan, could be the catalyst for change Greg didn't know he needed. Maybe he'd finally get the opportunity to prove himself, to climb out of this rut. Maybe he could become the person he had always dreamed of being. But then again, maybe Michael Jordan would just be another obstacle in the long line of things that had already gone wrong in Greg's life. Maybe this was just another situation that would leave him more broken than before. He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the self-pity. There was no time for that. There was work to be done. But the thought of the unknown, of Michael Jordan and what he could mean for Greg's future, lingered in the back of his mind like a storm on the horizon. The dealership was busy as usual the next morning. The lot was full of cars, and the showroom buzzed with customers and employees moving in every direction. Greg was trying his best to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Michael Jordan and the surprise encounter from the night before. It felt like everything had changed in an instant. The future of the dealership, his job, and even his life were now in the hands of someone he barely knew. Someone he had dismissed without even realizing who they were. Greg wasn't proud of how he had treated Michael. He had acted out of frustration, not thinking about the bigger picture. But now, as he walked through the dealership, he wondered what kind of leader Michael Jordan would be. Would he be a hands-off owner, just collecting profits? Or would he actually care about the dealership and its employees? Greg knew one thing for sure. He would have to prove himself to Michael. He had to show that he was more than just a disgruntled manager who was stuck in a dead-end job. He had to make things right, especially after the way he had treated Michael. As Greg walked into the showroom, his eyes locked onto the sleek, black Shelby GT 500 parked at the front of the lot. It was a beautiful car, and in many ways, it represented everything Greg had ever wanted. Success, status, and the feeling of accomplishment. But right now, it also symbolized something else, the unknown. What would Michael Jordan's ownership mean for the dealership? What would it mean for Greg? With a sigh, Greg headed to his office. It was time to face the future, whatever it held. As Greg sat at his desk, the door to his office opened without a knock. He looked up, only to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was Michael Jordan, looking as calm and confident as ever. "Greg, we need to talk," Michael said, his voice low and steady. Greg's heart skipped a beat as Michael Jordan walked into his office, closing the door behind him. The calm demeanor on Michael's face made the situation all the more intimidating. Greg had only ever seen the man in the media, on TV, dominating basketball courts, showing up in commercials, living a life that seemed worlds apart from his own. But now, Michael was standing right in front of him, and Greg felt a surge of panic. What did this mean for him? Why was he here? Was he about to fire Greg for being disrespectful the night before? Michael Jordan took a seat across from Greg, his eyes scanning the room before landing back on Greg. The silence in the room was palpable, thick with tension. Greg cleared his throat, trying to mask the nervousness in his voice. Mr. Jordan, can I help you?" Michael smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It's Michael. You don't need to call me Mr. Jordan." "Right," Greg muttered, adjusting his tie awkwardly. "So, what brings you in today? I didn't expect you, to be here. I mean, after everything." Michael nodded slowly, the weight of the words hanging between them. "I've been getting reports about this place, Greg. I'm not sure what kind of atmosphere you've created here, but I'm not impressed." Greg froze. He had known that things weren't perfect at the dealership, but he didn't think it was that bad. The sales numbers were steady enough, and the staff seemed to be getting by. What was Michael talking about? I'm sorry," Greg stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. "I mean, if you have concerns, I'm happy to hear them." Michael leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You've been running this place for a while, haven't you? Over a decade, I hear. But what's the point of experience if you're not willing to adapt? If you're not willing to take risks? I'm here to turn things around. I don't need someone stuck in the past." Greg's jaw clenched, but he kept his face neutral. This was exactly what he had feared. He wasn't one for risks. He preferred stability, routine, and the predictable cycle of life at the dealership. But now, with Michael Jordan breathing down his neck, he had no choice but to confront the harsh reality. This wasn't just a new owner. It was someone who would demand change. Greg was getting defensive. I've been doing this for a long time. I know what works. I understand the customers, the deals, the rhythms. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Michael raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. The world's changing, Greg. People don't want the same old, same old. They want innovation, excitement, and a feeling that they're not just another customer number in your system. They want more than a transaction. They want an experience. And right now, this dealership, it's as stale as the air in here. The words stung more than Greg wanted to admit. He had worked hard to keep the dealership running smoothly, to maintain what he had. The idea that it was all stale was like a slap in the face. Still, he tried to keep his composure. What are you suggesting then? Greg asked, trying to mask his frustration. That I just change everything? Throw out the way we've been doing things for years. Michael nodded. Exactly. You need to change, Greg, or I'll have to make that change for you. Greg felt a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. This wasn't just a discussion about the business. It was about his future. Everything he had worked for, the comfort of knowing his job was safe, that his routine was secure, was now being threatened by someone who didn't even seem to care about the years of loyalty he had put into this dealership. But I don't know if I can just, Greg started to protest. But Michael cut him off. You're going to have to, Greg. You have no choice. Michael leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The question is whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. The words hit Greg like a punch to the gut. How could he, someone who had always been content with the quiet, predictable life, now be forced to reinvent himself, forced to challenge everything he believed in? He had worked so hard to carve out a stable existence, but now, it seemed, stability was the very thing that would doom him. Michael stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked toward the window, looking out at the lot. I'm not here to break you, Greg, but if you want to keep your job, you'll need to step up. I don't care about your old habits, your old ways of thinking. What I care about is results. Greg felt his stomach twist. Results? He repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Michael turned, his gaze sharp. Yes, and that's why I'm putting you in charge of the first big change. You'll be leading the launch of a new customer experience program. It's going to be bold, innovative, and it's going to change everything. If you succeed, you'll have a chance to show me you're worthy of your position. But if you fail, well, let's just say I have no qualms about making a change. Greg's mind was racing. A new program? He had no idea where to start. But failure wasn't an option. Not again. He had failed once before, with his marriage, with his son. He couldn't let it happen here, not with his career. I'll do it, Greg said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. Michael nodded, satisfied. Good. I'll give you the resources you need, but from now on, I expect you to think like an owner, not a manager. With that, Michael turned and walked out of the office, leaving Greg alone in his thoughts. As the door clicked shut behind him, Greg was left alone in the silence of his office. His mind raced, his palms sweaty. He was terrified. Terrified of failing again. Terrified of the unknown. But more than that, he felt a strange, uneasy excitement bubbling inside him. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. The question was, could he rise to the challenge, or was this just another disaster waiting to happen? Greg sat at his desk for hours after Michael Jordan left, the weight of the conversation sinking in. The air felt thicker, like the walls of his office were closing in on him. The reality of the situation hit harder than he expected. He was being given an opportunity, yes, but it came with a pressure he had never faced before. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the task itself, or the fact that Michael Jordan had just handed him the keys to something potentially huge. A new customer experience program, bold and innovative. It sounded like something out of a business playbook, but to Greg, it felt like jumping off a cliff without a parachute. Still, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't back out. Not now. He had to make this work. The next few days were a blur of meetings, brainstorming sessions, and frantic phone calls with consultants and his team. Greg dove headfirst into the project, even though every part of him screamed for stability. He wasn't the kind of person who thrived on chaos, but chaos was exactly what this new program was promising. Greg had no idea where to even begin, so he started with what he knew: people. If there was one thing he understood, it was how customers interacted with the dealership. He spent his early days talking to the salespeople, customer service agents, and even the janitors who had a unique perspective on the place. He found himself in conversations he never thought he would have, asking about how customers felt when they walked through the door, what they were really looking for when they decided to buy a car, and how they felt after the purchase. But the more Greg listened, the more confused he became. Every person he talked to had a different idea of what a great experience looked like. One salesman suggested offering complimentary gourmet coffee while customers waited. Another thought interactive technology displays were the key to the future. A customer service agent thought better communication was the magic ingredient. Greg was overwhelmed. They all had good ideas, but none of them seemed to fit together. Was he supposed to turn the dealership into a luxury car showroom with all the trimmings? Or was he supposed to create a laid-back, fun atmosphere where customers felt like family? And then, amidst all the noise, something hit him. The answer wasn't about the bells and whistles. It wasn't about luxury cars, fancy coffee, or high-tech displays. It was about trust. People came to the dealership because they needed someone they could trust. They needed to feel like the dealership was looking out for them, not just trying to make a sale. That's when Greg realized the heart of the problem. The dealership had become transactional. It was all about numbers, deals, and getting customers in and out as quickly as possible. But it had lost something vital: the connection between the people and the place. He spent the next few weeks restructuring the way the dealership interacted with its customers. The new program wasn't about making things flashier. It was about making the experience personal. He created training sessions for his team that focused on empathy, communication, and creating lasting relationships. The goal wasn't just to sell cars, but to make customers feel valued and understood. Greg wasn't sure if Michael would approve of this approach. It wasn't bold in the way Michael probably wanted. It wasn't flashy or cutting edge, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long while, Greg felt like he was doing something he truly believed in. The night before the big launch, Greg couldn't sleep. He lay awake in bed, thinking about how much was riding on this: his career, his future, and the fate of the dealership. If this failed, it would be a disaster. But if it succeeded, well, Greg didn't want to think too far ahead. As the sun began to rise, Greg dragged himself out of bed. He took a long shower, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What if the staff didn't buy into the program? What if the customers hated it? What if Michael thought it was all a waste of time? But there was no turning back now. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The new program was set to launch today, and the whole team was expecting a change. They needed leadership, and it was up to Greg to show them that he could lead them through this. The dealership was buzzing with activity that morning. Greg had already prepared the team for the changes, but today was the day it all came together. The showrooms were set up differently, the staff had been trained, and there was a new sense of purpose in the air. Even the employees who had been skeptical of the changes seemed to be on board. Greg stood at the front of the showroom, pacing back and forth. He had the plan in his head, but the reality of it all was setting in. The staff was expecting him to make it work. He had to prove that his vision could truly change things for the better. Then, the first customer walked in. Greg's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the test. A middle-aged woman with a friendly smile approached the door, and immediately one of the sales associates greeted her with a warm handshake. The new system was simple: no hard sell, just a welcoming experience. Greg watched as the woman seemed surprised by the friendly reception, almost taken aback by the change in atmosphere. She was used to the cold, transactional nature of the old dealership, but today, there was something different in the air. The day progressed slowly at first, with more customers trickling in. As they came through the door, the employees were quick to engage with them, taking time to talk, asking what they were looking for, and offering information without rushing them. Greg could see that the program was working. The customers were responding to the new atmosphere. The staff was engaging. But it wasn't until later that afternoon that Greg got his first real indication of success. A couple came into the dealership looking for a family car. They were initially skeptical, but after talking to the sales team and seeing how genuinely invested everyone was in their needs, they began to open up. They were able to ask questions without feeling like they were being pressured into a decision. By the end of the day, Greg had sold more cars than he had in any other single day in recent memory. The feedback from the customers was overwhelmingly positive. They felt respected. They felt heard. As Greg walked through the dealership, pride swelling in his chest, his phone buzzed. He checked it quickly, and his stomach dropped. It was a message from Michael Jordan. "We need to talk. Tomorrow morning. I'm impressed, but I have some concerns. Don't get too comfortable." Greg's heart pounded in his chest. Was this the beginning of something good, or was it all about to fall apart? Greg had barely slept the night before. After the incredible success of the launch day, he had felt a surge of hope. Maybe he could do this. Maybe he could turn things around after all. But now, that hope was clouded by the message from Michael Jordan. He had spent hours analyzing every aspect of the new program, wondering if he had missed something, if there was a flaw in the plan he hadn't yet discovered. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. At 8 a.m. sharp, Greg stood outside his office, waiting for Michael to arrive. He had no idea what to expect. The anticipation gnawed at him, his stomach twisting in knots. Was Michael going to praise him for the results? Or would he tear apart the program he'd worked so hard to build? The door opened with a soft click, and Michael Jordan stepped into the room. His sharp, calculating gaze swept over Greg before he took a seat without a word. Greg swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. "Good morning, Michael. Thanks for coming in." Michael nodded. "Let's get straight to it, Greg. I saw the results from yesterday. I'll give you credit. Things went better than I expected. But there are still some issues we need to address." Greg felt his chest tighten, his palms sweating. He had been preparing himself for criticism, but hearing it in Michael's cool, detached tone made the anxiety flood his veins. "What kind of issues?" he asked, doing his best to sound calm. Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I like the direction you're heading in, Greg. I really do. The customers are responding, and that's good. But we need to scale up. This isn't enough. We're not just talking about one dealership here. We're talking about a nationwide transformation. If we want to create a real impact, we need to do more than just be friendly and personable. We need to set the standard." Greg's heart dropped. He had hoped for a simple, "well done, you've passed the test" moment, but instead, Michael was pushing for something even bigger. It wasn't just about this one dealership anymore. It was about transforming the entire brand. "Scale up?" Greg repeated, struggling to keep up with the expectations. I don't understand. We're doing everything we can. We're listening to the customers, giving them a personalized experience. What else is there?" Michael's gaze softened, but only slightly. "We need to incorporate technology into this. I'm talking about using data and cutting-edge tools to better understand our customers and anticipate their needs. I want to integrate a customer relationship management system, CRM, across every dealership. I want to gather data that shows us exactly what the customers want before they even walk through the door." Greg felt his breath catch in his throat. This was a whole new level. He hadn't considered using advanced technology to track every customer's preferences. It was like taking a leap into an unknown world where data reigned supreme over human connection. Could he keep the personal touch while integrating all of that? "I see," Greg muttered, trying to grasp the concept. "But how do we balance that with the experience we've already built? People don't want to feel like they're just another number in a system." Michael's eyes narrowed, the tension in the room palpable. "Exactly. That's why I'm counting on you, Greg. You know people. You know the dealership. You're going to figure out how to make this work, how to give people that personalized experience while using technology to predict their needs and offer them what they really want." The weight of the responsibility hit Greg all at once. He had spent years building relationships with his customers. Now, Michael was asking him to transform that very foundation, to create something that combined the human touch with the cold precision of technology. It felt like a betrayal of everything he had ever believed in. His mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. "I'll do it, Michael," he said, his voice firm despite the fear and uncertainty rising inside him. I'll figure out how to merge the human experience with the technology. But it's going to take time. We need to test it, learn from it, and adjust. Michael nodded. Good. I'm glad to hear that. But make no mistake, Greg. This isn't just about testing. We need results, and we need them fast. The challenge was immense, and Greg felt the enormity of it all. How was he going to keep up? He wasn't a tech guru. He was a people person. But Michael was right. The world was changing, and if Greg didn't adapt, he might as well pack up and leave. As Michael turned to leave, he paused in the doorway, looking back at Greg. One more thing, Greg. I'm putting you in charge of the nationwide rollout. The stakes are higher now. I need you to step up and prove that you can handle this. Greg stood there in stunned silence as Michael walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, and Greg felt a wave of dread wash over him. He had thought that the toughest part of the job was over when they launched the program, but that was nothing compared to what lay ahead. He wasn't just managing a single dealership anymore. He was about to lead a revolution across the entire company. Greg sat down at his desk, his head spinning with the weight of Michael's words. Nationwide rollout? The stakes were higher now than he had ever imagined. He was no longer just a manager. He was the face of this change, the one who had to make it work. But what if he failed? What if, despite his best efforts, he couldn't merge the human touch with the world of technology? What if, in trying to keep up with Michael's expectations, he lost what had made the dealership special in the first place? Greg stared at his reflection in the window, the uncertainty of the future staring back at him. He had a choice to make. Either step up and lead this revolution, or watch it all fall apart. And he knew, deep down, that he couldn't let it all slip away. The weeks that followed Michael's conversation with Greg felt like a blur. Each day, Greg found himself entrenched in a whirlwind of planning, meetings, and sleepless nights. The weight of the new responsibility pressed down on him like a boulder, and though he knew he couldn't back out, there were moments when he wondered if he was in over his head. Every department in the dealership was involved in the new initiative: sales teams, customer service, IT, even marketing. Everyone had to come together to form a unified plan that blended the best of customer experience with cutting-edge technology. But the real challenge, Greg realized, was managing all these moving parts without losing sight of the human element. The idea was clear: create a personalized customer experience with the help of data-driven insights. But how would that look in practice? It was easy enough to talk about, but the logistics of bringing it to life were much more complicated than he had imagined. Greg found himself spending long hours with the IT team, discussing how they could implement a customer relationship management (CRM) system that would give them insight into every customer's preferences and buying habits. It wasn't just about tracking who bought what. It was about anticipating what customers might need next, understanding their desires even before they voiced them. The goal was to predict the future, to know what every customer wanted, even before they walked through the door. As much as Greg understood the benefits of using data, the thought of it still unsettled him. He kept picturing a future where every interaction felt cold and robotic, where customers were treated like data points rather than individuals. How could he ensure that this new system wouldn't take away the warmth of the dealership he had worked so hard to create? One day, after an especially grueling meeting, Greg found himself walking through the dealership's lot. The sight of the cars lined up, shining under the midday sun, gave him a sense of clarity. He had worked at this dealership for years, and through every hardship, it had become more than just a place to sell cars. It had become his family. The salespeople, the service team, even the receptionist. Each person was a part of something bigger, something more meaningful. As he stood there, lost in thought, Sarah, one of the saleswomen, approached him with a smile. "Hey, Greg," she said, her tone light. "I wanted to check in with you. How's everything going with that big tech rollout? Everyone's talking about it, and I'm curious. How's it all shaping up?" Greg chuckled, rubbing his temples. "It's a lot, to be honest. A lot of moving pieces. I think we're starting to get a handle on it, but there's still a long way to go." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "I get that. It's a big change, but I think you're handling it well. I've noticed a shift in the way people are interacting with customers lately. There's more patience, more listening." Greg's eyes widened slightly. You've noticed that? Yeah, it's subtle, but it's there. Customers are definitely responding to it. They're not feeling rushed anymore. And I think it's because we're taking more time to understand their needs, not just pushing for a sale. Greg felt a sense of relief wash over him. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't losing the essence of the dealership after all. Maybe the technology could work with the personal touch rather than replace it. As the weeks went by, Greg continued to meet with his team, refining the system, making sure it wasn't just about the data but about connecting with the customers on a deeper level. The training sessions, focused on empathy, active listening, and communication, remained central to the program's success. It was clear that this wasn't just about making a sale. It was about making an impact on the lives of the people who walked through the dealership doors. It was slow progress, but it was progress nonetheless. Greg started to see the change in his staff. They were beginning to embrace the new system. And the customers? They seemed more at ease than before, more willing to trust the team. Word of mouth spread, and the dealership started gaining a reputation not just for selling cars, but for genuinely caring about its customers. Then, one crisp afternoon, Michael walked into the dealership again. This time, it was different. He didn't come in with the intensity of his previous visit, the pressure of expectations weighing down on Greg. Instead, he came in quietly, surveying the lot, the showroom, and the employees as though taking a mental note of everything he saw. Greg met him at the door, doing his best to mask his anxiety. "Hey, Michael. Glad you could make it." Michael offered him a faint smile. "I've been watching. I've been impressed." Greg's heart skipped a beat. "Really? You think it's working?" Michael nodded slowly. "I do. The data is looking good, but more importantly, the customers are responding. The feedback we're getting has been overwhelmingly positive. You've built something here, Greg. You've found the balance." Relief flooded through Greg. He had spent so many sleepless nights worrying about whether he had made the right decision, if he had let the pressure of the task push him too far from his core values. But now, standing in front of Michael, he realized he had done it. He had created a solution that worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Michael paused, his eyes glancing over the showroom. "You've taken a risk, Greg, and it's paying off." "I couldn't have done it without the team," Greg said, his voice soft but filled with pride. Everyone stepped up. They believed in the vision. Michael smiled, his eyes gleaming with a rare warmth. "You've proven something important, Greg. You've shown that you can lead through change without losing what matters. That's not easy to do." As the conversation continued, Greg felt a shift within himself. He had been so focused on the fear of failure, on the overwhelming expectations, that he had almost forgotten why he had started this journey in the first place. To make a difference, not just in the dealership, but in the lives of the people who walked through its doors. And now, after all the struggles, all the sleepless nights, he finally understood. This was more than just a job, more than just a business. This was about people, about creating a space where trust and connection could thrive. It was about changing the way people experienced car buying, and in doing so, changing their lives. As Michael walked away, Greg stood there in the middle of the showroom, taking it all in. The weight on his shoulders wasn't gone, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. He had learned a valuable lesson through all of this. No matter how hard things got, there was always room for hope, for growth, for change. And that, in the end, was the true victory. As the dealership's success continued to grow, Greg's thoughts were interrupted one evening when his phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen to see an unexpected message from Sarah. "Greg, something's come up. I need to talk to you. It's about the new system." Greg felt his stomach drop. What could possibly go wrong now? Greg had just finished a long day at the dealership. The sales figures were looking promising, and the CRM system, which had once seemed like an overwhelming, uncharted territory, was now starting to show signs of success. Customers were more engaged, and the staff was working more efficiently. For the first time in weeks, Greg felt like he could breathe. But then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Greg, something's come up. I need to talk to you. It's about the new system." A chill ran down his spine. He had no idea what Sarah meant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She was one of the top salespeople at the dealership, always reliable and level-headed. If she was reaching out like this, it could only mean one thing: trouble. He quickly called her back. "Hey, Sarah, what's going on?" Greg asked, trying to sound calm even though his nerves were starting to fray. Sarah's voice came through the phone, sounding tense. "Greg, I think we've got a problem with the system. It's not what we thought. Customers are starting to notice, and it's starting to create some tension." Greg's heart sank. "What kind of tension?" "There's a disconnect," Sarah explained. Her words rushed. "The data's great, sure, but we've lost the personal touch. Customers feel like they're being treated like data points, not people. They don't like it. They're starting to question whether we're really listening to them or just running their information through a system." Greg felt the weight of Sarah's words hit him like a brick wall. This was the last thing he had expected to hear. After everything he'd been through to integrate the CRM system, to keep the personal experience intact, how could this be happening? "Are you sure? Maybe it's just a few isolated cases," Greg said, trying to grasp at any hope that this was just a small hiccup. "No, it's more than that," Sarah said, her voice more urgent now. "I've had customers come up to me, asking if we're tracking their every move. They're uneasy. They want the experience they've always had, the one where we know them, where we remember their names, where we talk to them like real people. The data is making them feel like they're just another sale." Greg's mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. The system was supposed to enhance the experience, not replace it. He had worked so hard to create a balance between the two, but now it felt like he had failed. "I need to fix this," Greg muttered to himself. "I'll be there soon. We need to figure out what's going wrong." As Greg hung up, he stood there for a moment, staring out the window of his office. The sunset painted the sky with shades of orange and pink, but it didn't bring him the usual sense of peace. The dealership that had once felt like a safe haven now seemed to be unraveling in front of him. He had to act fast. If customers were starting to feel alienated, the reputation of the dealership could be on the line. But more than that, he was afraid of losing the one thing he had worked so hard to build: the personal connection, the human touch that had made this dealership stand out. He grabbed his jacket and headed out to the showroom, hoping that Sarah and the team could help him figure out a solution. When he arrived, he saw her talking to two other salespeople, Jason and Linda, both looking concerned. They turned when they saw him approach. "Greg," Sarah greeted him, her tone soft but serious. "I've spoken to a few more customers, and it's not just a handful anymore. We've got a real issue here." Greg nodded, his mind racing. "Okay, let's talk about what's been happening. Tell me everything." Linda, the newest member of the sales team, stepped forward. "I had a customer today who wanted to trade in his car. He's been coming here for years, but today, it felt like he didn't want to talk to me. He kept asking about the system, about how much data we were collecting. It's like he was afraid we knew more about him than he was comfortable with." Greg rubbed his temples. He understood the concern. The more data they gathered, the more customers might start to feel like their privacy was being invaded. He had thought the system would give them an edge, but now it was starting to feel like a liability. Jason added, "The system is great for tracking customer preferences, but it's hard to make someone feel like you're genuinely listening when it feels like you're just pulling information from a database." Greg took a deep breath, trying to absorb everything. "Okay, so what's the solution? How do we fix this?" Sarah looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "Maybe we've been so focused on the data that we forgot why people come here in the first place. It's not just about their buying habits. It's about their stories. We need to get back to what made us special. Let's use the data to enhance the experience, not replace it." Greg felt a flicker of hope. "So, what are you suggesting?" "We need to start by making sure our team feels confident with the system, but also remind them that it's just a tool. We can still have real conversations, remember the small things that matter. And when we use the system, we need to do it transparently. Let the customers know what we're doing and why we're doing it." Jason chimed in, "And maybe we can use the system to give us more time for personal interaction. For example, if we know a customer is coming in for a test drive, we could prepare in advance, have some background on what they're looking for, but still make sure we ask them about their day, about their family, about their needs." Greg nodded, feeling the weight on his shoulders lift slightly. He could do this. They could do this. It was all about finding the balance, as he always had. He turned to Sarah. Let's take action. I'll talk to the IT team, and we'll come up with a plan to tweak the system. We'll make sure it serves the customer, not the other way around. We'll remind everyone here what's important, our relationships with the people who walk through these doors. Sarah smiled, relief in her eyes. Sounds like a plan. As the team gathered around him, Greg realized something important. The road to success wasn't about choosing between technology and personal connection. It was about finding a way to bring them together in a way that benefited everyone involved, customers, employees, and the dealership itself. They had faced their first real setback, but Greg wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He had learned one critical lesson on this journey. No matter how difficult things got, there was always a way to come back stronger. They just had to keep working at it, one step at a time. As Greg left the meeting, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from Michael Jordan. He opened it quickly, his heart racing. The subject line read, "We need to talk. Urgent." Greg felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What now? Was the system still not good enough? What was Michael going to say? Greg stood frozen for a moment, staring at the email. "We need to talk. Urgent." His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure how to respond. Michael Jordan, an icon in sports, a successful businessman, and now an integral part of this dealership, was requesting a meeting. But the tone of his email left Greg with a knot in his stomach. He clicked on the email, reading it again, hoping it would offer more clarity. There was no additional information, just that Michael wanted to meet in person as soon as possible. Greg couldn't help but feel a mix of dread and anticipation. What was this about? Without wasting any more time, Greg quickly responded, arranging to meet Michael the next morning at 9 a.m. It wasn't unusual for Michael to drop in unannounced, but the word urgent made Greg anxious. Was the new system causing even more problems than he'd imagined? The next morning, Greg arrived early at the dealership, preparing for whatever conversation lay ahead. He had a lot on his mind: Sarah's concerns, the tweaks they were planning to make to the CRM system, and now, this mysterious meeting with Michael. It had been a long, stressful few weeks, and he could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. At 9 a.m. sharp, Michael walked into the dealership's conference room. Dressed in a sharp suit, as always, he exuded a quiet confidence. But there was something different about the way he walked today. A sense of urgency, an energy that didn't quite match his usual calm demeanor. "Greg, good to see you," Michael said, his voice even, though his eyes betrayed a sense of determination. "Good to see you too, Michael. I got your email. What's going on?" Greg asked, trying to keep his tone casual, even though he was burning with curiosity. Michael wasted no time. "I've been doing some research," he began, sitting down across from Greg. "And I've been getting some feedback, not just from our customers, but from other dealerships, other industry leaders. And there's one thing that's come up repeatedly. It's about the balance between technology and human connection. It's been on my mind." Greg felt a lump form in his throat. Was this about the system? Had they missed the mark completely? Michael continued, "I think we're doing something great here. The system you've implemented, the changes you've made, it's all very forward-thinking. But we need to take a step back and think about how we present it to the customers." Greg nodded, unsure where this was headed. "What do you mean?" "The system is incredible, don't get me wrong. It's got all the data we need to make smarter decisions, but it's not about the data, it's about how we use it. Right now, we're at risk of coming across as too cold, too corporate, too automated." Greg leaned forward, feeling a sense of urgency himself. "But we're trying to make things more efficient. We're trying to improve the customer experience." "I get that," Michael said, his voice softening, "but there's a fine line. People still want to feel like they matter, like they're more than just a number in the system. If we focus too much on the data, we risk losing the heart of this business. And I'm worried we've crossed that line." Greg sat back in his chair, processing Michael's words. He had always known that the personal touch was key, but now, hearing Michael, who had built a career on the power of personal connections and understanding people, saying this, it hit him hard. Michael was right. Technology could only go so far. At the end of the day, people still craved authentic relationships, So, what do we do? Greg asked, his voice steady but filled with doubt. How do we fix this? Michael didn't hesitate. We reframe the conversation. The system isn't the centerpiece here. It's the tool that empowers our team to create real, lasting connections with our customers. But we have to remind the customers that it's just a tool. The people here, the sales team, the service staff, they're the ones who make the difference. Greg's mind started to clear. The solution was simpler than he'd imagined. It wasn't about scrapping the system or going back to the old way of doing things. It was about shifting the focus. Instead of letting the technology define the experience, they needed to let the people define it. So, we make sure the human touch is at the forefront, Greg said slowly, as the idea began to take shape in his mind. We show the customers that we're using the system to understand them better, but we never lose sight of the fact that it's the people that matter most. Michael smiled. Exactly. We make sure our team knows the data, but also knows how to listen. And we let the customers know that the system is there to enhance their experience, not to replace the personal connection. Greg felt a wave of relief wash over him. This wasn't the end of the road, but a course correction. They hadn't failed. They had simply hit a bump in the road, and now they had a clear path forward. Okay, Greg said, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. I can work with that. We can make it work. Michael nodded approvingly. I knew you would. Greg, this dealership has potential. But it's your leadership, your ability to balance technology with the human touch, that's going to make it a model for the future. Greg's confidence grew with Michael's words. There was still a lot of work to be done, but now he had a clearer vision of what needed to happen. It wasn't just about being innovative. It was about staying true to what made the dealership special. And that was the people. Thanks, Michael, Greg said, standing up and shaking Michael's hand. I appreciate your honesty. This is exactly what I needed to hear. Michael smiled again, this time with a hint of pride. You're doing great, Greg. I've got no doubt you'll make this work. As Michael left the conference room, Greg sat back down at the table, a new sense of purpose filling him. The next steps were clear now. It wasn't going to be easy, but Greg was ready for the challenge. The road ahead would require patience, focus, and a willingness to adapt. But Greg was confident that they could build something even stronger than before. He wasn't just going to lead a successful dealership. He was going to lead a business that was truly human in every sense of the word. Just as Greg was about to leave for the day, he received another email, this time from Sarah. The subject line read, "Something strange is going on with the system. You need to see this." Greg's heart sank. What now? Could it be that their solution wasn't enough after all? Greg stood still, staring at Sarah's email. The subject line echoed in his mind. Something strange is going on with the system. You need to see this. It was almost as though the universe had conspired to throw him one challenge after another. He opened the email quickly, hoping for some sort of simple issue, maybe a minor bug. But as he read, his heart dropped into his stomach. The email was brief but clear. Greg, I'm noticing some discrepancies in the data. Certain customers' information is being duplicated, while others are missing key details, like their contact info and preferences. Some are even showing up as new leads, even though they've been with us for years. This is affecting the system's functionality, and I'm afraid it might alienate some loyal customers. Please check it out as soon as possible. Sarah. Greg's mind raced as he processed the information. The CRM system had been running relatively smoothly for the past few weeks. Sure, there had been a few hiccups, but nothing major. Certainly nothing that could threaten the relationship with their customers. And now, Sarah was telling him that some of their most loyal customers might be impacted. This could be the exact thing that destroyed the trust they'd been building. Without wasting another second, Greg grabbed his coat, his thoughts racing as he walked quickly toward the showroom floor. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. When he arrived, he found Sarah at her desk, looking over her computer screen, her face a mix of concern and frustration. As soon as she saw Greg approaching, she stood up, her eyes wide with worry. "Greg, I'm glad you're here," she said, gesturing for him to sit down beside her. "I've been digging into the data all morning, and I'm finding a lot of issues. These discrepancies are widespread. Some of our longtime clients are showing up as new leads, and some of our most important details, Things we've documented over the years are just gone. Greg took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He had to keep his head in the game. Okay, so what exactly is happening? How many customers are affected? I'd say at least 25% of our database is showing up with issues, Sarah explained, tapping a few keys to pull up a list of names. Here's an example: Mark and Lisa Thompson. They've been customers for years. They bought 3 cars from us, always get their service here, but in the system, it shows them as new leads who've never purchased anything. Greg's stomach tightened. The Thompsons were a key part of the dealership's community. They were vocal advocates, and any suggestion that they were treated like new leads could easily create a rift in the customer's perception of the business. What's going on with their data? Why is this happening? Greg asked, leaning in to get a closer look. I'm not sure yet, Sarah replied, her voice shaking slightly. It looks like a bug, but it's more than just a simple glitch. We might have a data integrity issue, and I don't think it's isolated to just a few customers. It might be systemic. Greg felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The last thing they needed was another setback. Just when he thought they were getting ahead, this happened. This wasn't just a technical issue, it was a trust issue. If customers saw that their information was being mishandled, even unintentionally, it would undermine everything they had worked so hard to build. Okay, Greg said, forcing himself to stay focused. Let's tackle this methodically. We need to identify how widespread the problem is first. Can you run a search across all customer data to see how many are affected? Sarah nodded quickly. I'm already working on it. It'll take a few minutes, but I'll have the results soon. Greg watched her work, feeling a growing sense of urgency. Every second they wasted could mean losing a valuable customer. The last thing he wanted was for this to turn into a bigger issue than it already was. As Sarah ran the query, Greg pulled out his phone and texted Michael. Urgent. We're having some issues with the system. Data integrity problems. I'll keep you updated. Michael's response came in quickly. Let me know what you need, Greg. I'm here to help. While Greg appreciated the support, he couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. This was his problem to solve, and he needed to fix it quickly. Got it, Sarah said, her voice calm but strained. I ran the search across our entire database. Over 50% of the customer records have been impacted. That's over 10,000 customers, Greg. Greg's breath caught in his throat. This was worse than he had imagined. 10,000 customers. The thought of how many relationships had been disrupted sent a jolt of panic through him. Can we fix it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hesitated before answering. It's not going to be easy. The bug is deep in the system, and it's affecting multiple aspects of the CRM. We're going to need to bring in the IT team to get to the bottom of this, but it could take days, or even weeks, to fully resolve. Greg's mind began to spin. They didn't have that long. The longer this problem persisted, the more customers would notice, and the more their trust would erode. He couldn't afford to let that happen. We need to act fast, Greg said, his voice firm. I'll get the IT team on it. Sarah, you and I need to start reaching out to customers. We need to let them know what's going on, and we need to make sure they feel heard. Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. I'll start drafting some emails to send out. We can offer them a personal touch, something that lets them know we're doing everything we can to fix this. Greg felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. It wasn't an ideal situation, but at least they had a plan. They would get through this. He wasn't about to let something as trivial as a system glitch tear down everything they had built. All right, let's get to work, Greg said, standing up. We've got a lot to do, but we'll fix this. As Greg walked out of the office to meet with the IT team, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Michael. I've been hearing some complaints. I think it's time we start looking at a bigger solution. Greg's heart skipped a beat. What did Michael mean by bigger solution? Was the system beyond repair? Greg's phone buzzed in his pocket again, pulling him out of his thoughts. He had just finished speaking with the IT team, who were scrambling to isolate the source of the data glitch. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were on it. The pressure was still mounting, but for now, he could take solace in knowing that the wheels were turning. He pulled out his phone, glancing at Michael's message once more. I've been hearing some complaints. I think it's time we start looking at a bigger solution. Greg's heart rate spiked. He couldn't decide if the message was a sign of impending doom or a challenge. Was Michael doubting their ability to fix the current system? Or was he suggesting they overhaul everything, starting from scratch? With a deep breath, Greg typed a quick response. What do you mean by a bigger solution? Are we looking at a complete system overhaul? The dots in the text box appeared almost instantly, a sign that Michael was typing back. Greg couldn't help but feel his anxiety climb. What could this mean? A new system? A new approach to the dealership itself? The phone vibrated again, and Greg held his breath as he read Michael's reply. Not necessarily an overhaul, but it might be time to explore a more customized approach. I've been talking to some industry experts and doing a little research of my own. It's clear to me that we need a system that not only works but grows with us. We need something that fits our needs, not the other way around. Greg leaned against the nearest wall, trying to absorb the weight of Michael's words. A more customized approach. That could mean a complete rework of the entire CRM and possibly more. New integrations, custom features, something unique. It could be the solution they needed, but it also came with its own risks. He typed back, "How soon do you want to explore this? We're still dealing with the data issue, but if this is a bigger shift, we need to be prepared." Another quick response from Michael, "Let's schedule a meeting tomorrow. We'll talk it through. I want us to be proactive, not reactive. We've got the opportunity to lead the way here, Greg. Let's make sure we don't just solve the problem but set ourselves up for long-term success." Greg sat there for a moment, staring at the screen. Long-term success. That was the vision they all wanted, right? But with that came the risk of something bigger, something that might shake things up even more than they had already been shaken. He put his phone back in his pocket and walked back into Sarah's office. She was sitting at her desk, looking through customer feedback emails, trying to sort through the mess they were about to fix. "Sarah," Greg started, walking over to her. "I just heard back from Michael. It looks like he wants us to look into a bigger solution for the dealership's tech, something more customized. We might need to overhaul the CRM altogether." Sarah's eyebrows furrowed as she looked up. "An overhaul? But we've been working with this system for months now. It's not perfect, but it's working. Do we really want to risk starting from scratch?" Greg nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. The thought of a complete overhaul was daunting. They had put so much effort into tweaking the current system, ironing out kinks, and making it fit their needs. The idea of starting from square one felt overwhelming, but Michael's words were persuasive. He wasn't just looking for a quick fix, he was thinking about the future. "I don't know yet," Greg replied. "But Michael seems to think that if we really want to lead the industry, we need a solution that grows with us. It might mean customizing everything, finding a system that can evolve with our needs, not just one that fixes the current issues." Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "It sounds like a huge undertaking, but I guess if we're really going to scale and build something long-term, we can't keep patching things up as we go." Greg walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know it's a lot, but we'll figure it out. I think we need to meet with Michael tomorrow and lay out a plan. The IT team is already on fixing the immediate issues, but we need to think ahead." Sarah nodded, though her expression was still uncertain. "Okay, let's do it. But I still don't know what this new system will even look like. Are we going to bring in a consultant or build something ourselves?" "That's what we need to figure out tomorrow," Greg replied. "We'll look at all the options. A custom solution could give us a competitive edge, but it's going to take time and resources. I just hope we can make the right call." Sarah leaned back in her chair, clearly processing the weight of everything. "And what about the customers? I mean, we're still dealing with the issues in the system right now. How do we explain to them that we're going to overhaul everything?" Greg ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. "That's the part I'm most worried about. We don't want them to feel like we're making more promises we can't keep. But we also don't want to leave them hanging while we figure all of this out." "Right," Sarah said softly. "We've got to strike the balance between being honest and assuring them that we're committed to improving." Greg smiled faintly. "That's the challenge, isn't it?" He felt a surge of determination. He knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he had already come this far. They were going to figure this out, one step at a time. And whatever solution they decided on, Greg was certain of one thing. It had to work for their customers first and foremost. Just as Greg was about to leave Sarah's office, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unfamiliar number. "We know what's going on. Meet us in 24 hours. The future of your business depends on it." Greg's pulse quickened. Who was this, and what did they know? Greg stood frozen in Sarah's office, staring at the phone in his hand. The message had shaken him to his core. "We know what's going on. Meet us in 24 hours. The future of your business depends on it." Who were these people? And how did they know what was happening? Greg had never heard of anyone connected to the dealership who would be sending such cryptic messages. It wasn't like Michael, and it wasn't the IT team either. In fact, it felt like something else entirely, someone who had insider knowledge about not just the data glitch, but perhaps about the bigger picture. Greg? Sarah's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. She was standing next to him, concern written across her face. "What's going on?" He showed her the phone, and as she read the message, her expression mirrored his confusion. "Who could be sending this?" Sarah asked, furrowing her brow. "This doesn't sound like anyone from the dealership or even someone close to us. It's like they're spying on us." Greg felt a surge of tension rise within him. This was too much. The data problems were already a lot to handle, and now, out of nowhere, came this unsettling message. What did they want? And how were they involved in the future of his business? "Do you think it could be a competitor?" Greg asked, though he didn't fully believe it. Why would a competitor send such a cryptic message? If anything, they'd just be out to sabotage, not offer help, or demand a meeting. "I don't know," Sarah replied, "but it seems too targeted. It's not like a typical corporate threat or anything. This feels personal." Greg's stomach twisted. If they were targeting the dealership because of the data glitch, that could mean much worse things were in store for him and the entire team. He couldn't let himself panic, though. He had to think this through. "Do we respond?" Sarah asked, the uncertainty in her voice clear. "I mean, how do we even begin to handle something like this?" Greg shook his head. "Not yet. I want to take a moment and think about what it could mean. The timing of it, it's too convenient. We're dealing with all these issues internally, and now someone is reaching out with an ultimatum. It feels like it's more than just an isolated issue." He paced for a moment, trying to clear his mind. The more he thought about it, the more the message seemed like a warning. It felt almost like a demand to meet, but not with an overt threat. More like they were giving him one chance to fix things. But fix what, exactly? "I'm going to talk to Michael," Greg finally decided. "Maybe he knows something. We're in the middle of figuring out our next steps, and now this is just throwing everything off balance. I need to understand what's really going on here." He sent a quick text to Michael, letting him know about the message. "Got a strange message from someone who seems to know about the glitch and everything we're dealing with. They want to meet in 24 hours. Any idea who could be behind this?" Greg didn't expect a quick reply. Michael was often hard to reach during the day, but this was an urgent matter. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Before he could hear back, Sarah spoke again, her voice quiet but urgent. "What if this is bigger than we think, Greg? What if someone's trying to take advantage of the situation?" Greg paused, his eyes narrowing. She had a point. Whoever this was seemed to know what was going on with the dealership. If they had access to that kind of information, it meant they had been watching for some time. It wasn't just about a system glitch. It was about power, influence, and perhaps an attempt to manipulate the future of the business. "If they're trying to take advantage of us," Greg said, his voice low, "we'll deal with it. But I need to know who they are first. I'm not about to let some stranger dictate the future of this place." A ping from his phone interrupted their conversation. Michael had replied, "Don't like the sound of this. I don't know who it could be, but let's meet tomorrow. I've been hearing rumors about people trying to buy up smaller dealerships. Could be something related. We'll talk then." Greg's eyes scanned the message quickly. Buying up smaller dealerships. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Was this person trying to get the upper hand by causing chaos and then swooping in to take over? "Michael's on board," Greg said, showing Sarah the message. "He thinks this could be connected to the bigger industry changes. He's heard rumors about larger players trying to buy up smaller dealerships. We need to be on guard." Sarah's eyes widened. "Wait, you don't think they could be trying to buy us, do you? Are we really that vulnerable?" Greg's stomach churned at the thought. Could they really be that close to losing control of their own business? But if this was about something bigger, like industry consolidation or competition, this could be serious. I don't know, Greg admitted, but we need to prepare for anything. This isn't just about fixing the glitch anymore. This could change everything. They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them. Everything they had worked for could be at risk, and they had no idea who was behind the mysterious message or what they wanted. Okay, Sarah said, standing up and gathering her things. We meet with Michael tomorrow. But before that, we need to make sure we're ready. Let's stay one step ahead of whoever this is. I'll double-check everything with the IT team and the customer relations department. We can't afford to have any more surprises. Greg nodded. Right. Let's make sure we're prepared. As they walked out of Sarah's office and toward the parking lot, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that their world was about to change. The business they had fought so hard to build. Could it really be slipping through their fingers? Just as Greg was about to get into his car, a sleek black car pulled into the dealership lot. A tall man in a suit stepped out, holding a briefcase. Greg's gut instinct told him this wasn't just a routine visitor. The man walked up to Greg with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You Greg Mitchell? He asked. I think we need to talk. Greg's heart skipped a beat as he watched the tall man approach. There was something about him, the way he carried himself, the crispness of his suit, that made Greg uneasy. The man was confident, almost too confident, and there was no telling what kind of business he was here for. Greg adjusted his stance, trying to maintain composure. He wasn't about to let someone throw him off balance, not now. He had enough on his plate already. The man stopped in front of Greg, extending a hand. His handshake was firm but not overpowering, calculated in a way that made Greg feel immediately on edge. You Greg Mitchell? The man asked again, his voice smooth but with an edge that made Greg's spine stiffen. I think we need to talk. Greg studied the man for a moment, sizing him up. The stranger was tall, dressed impeccably, with short-cropped dark hair and a pair of sharp eyes that seemed to be analyzing every move Greg made. He didn't look like anyone Greg had ever seen around here before. That's me, Greg said cautiously. And you are? The man gave a slight smile, not one of warmth, but more like the kind of smile someone gives when they know they have the upper hand. My name's Aaron Caldwell. I represent a group of investors looking to make strategic acquisitions. I'm sure you've heard the rumors about industry consolidation. Greg's stomach tightened. This wasn't a casual visit. He had suspected that something bigger might be happening, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, trying to keep up with the rapid unfolding of events. Was this the person behind the cryptic message? Or was this someone entirely different, trying to seize the moment? I've heard, Greg replied, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. But I don't think I need an investor at the moment. Aaron's smile didn't falter. That's where you're wrong, Greg. We're offering you an opportunity. An opportunity to stay in control of your business, but only if you're willing to make a deal. I'm here to discuss terms. There's no need to let things get more complicated than they already are. Greg felt a sudden rush of frustration, but he kept his cool. The last thing he wanted was to be cornered by some slick investor looking to swoop in when the dealership was vulnerable. If Aaron was here, that meant things had escalated much faster than he had expected. Thanks, but no thanks, Greg said, trying to walk away. He wasn't about to entertain this man's offer. Not yet. There was too much at stake, and he wasn't about to hand over control to someone who couldn't even be bothered to give a clear explanation of what they wanted. But Aaron didn't move, his eyes following Greg as he took a few steps toward the building. I wouldn't be so hasty if I were you, Aaron said, his voice low and firm. There's a lot more at stake than you realize. Your system's failures? That's just the beginning. You're on the brink of something much bigger. You need someone who understands how to make it work. Greg stopped in his tracks, his back stiffening. Aaron's words hit too close to home, and for a moment, Greg wasn't sure if the man was just trying to scare him into a deal or if he truly knew something about the larger picture. What do you mean? Greg asked, turning back to face Aaron. His curiosity got the better of him. Aaron gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if he had expected Greg to ask the question. I'm not just talking about the tech issues. I'm talking about your position in the market, your dealership's growth potential. Without the right guidance, it could all slip away in the blink of an eye. Greg clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a casual offer. This was a calculated move, and it felt like the stakes were rising with every word Aaron spoke. I'm not interested in handing over my business to anyone, Greg said, his voice harder now. So if you're here to buy me out, you can forget it. Aaron didn't seem fazed. If anything, he seemed more determined. I'm not asking you to hand over control, at least not yet. What I'm offering is a partnership. A partnership that could bring your dealership to new heights. But you have to be willing to listen. Greg shook his head. I don't trust people who don't explain themselves clearly. What exactly are you offering? Aaron smiled again, though it was a cold smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. I'm offering expertise, capital, and strategic insight. We've been watching your dealership for some time, Greg. We know you're struggling with the tech issues, but we also know you have potential. A lot of it. With the right support, we can help you turn things around. Greg was taken aback by Aaron's boldness. He had no doubt that this man and his investors had done their homework, but that didn't mean he was ready to trust them. Not yet. I appreciate the offer, Greg said, trying to keep his tone neutral, but I'm not going to make any decisions right now. I need to think things over. Aaron's eyes narrowed slightly, as though sizing Greg up, assessing whether he was a risk worth taking. I understand. But just so you know, Greg, opportunities like this don't come around often. I suggest you take some time to consider it. And remember, the future of your business, whether you want it or not, is in our hands now. With that, Aaron turned and walked back to his car, leaving Greg standing there, a rush of conflicting thoughts swirling in his mind. What had just happened? And what did Aaron mean by "in our hands now"? Greg's hands clenched into fists at his sides. This wasn't just about fixing a broken system anymore. There were much bigger forces at play now, and he had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. As the sleek black car drove away, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that his next steps could determine the future of everything he had worked so hard to build. As Greg stood there, his phone buzzed in his pocket again. He pulled it out, his stomach sinking as he read the text message from Michael. I don't trust this. Something's off. Meet me at the office in 20 minutes. We need to plan our next move. Greg's hands trembled slightly as he read Michael's message. The urgency in his tone was unmistakable. He needed to meet with Michael immediately. The earlier encounter with Aaron had left Greg on edge, and now, with Michael hinting at something being off, Greg couldn't ignore the feeling that they were on the brink of something much bigger than a simple tech glitch or even an acquisition attempt. He quickly slid into his car, the roar of the engine feeling almost cathartic as it drowned out the racing thoughts in his head. The dealership had always been his dream, his livelihood. He had built it up from scratch, but now he wasn't sure what direction it was headed in. As he pulled into the parking lot of the dealership, Greg spotted Michael standing by the front doors, arms crossed, looking as if he had been expecting him. The expression on his face was serious, too serious for Greg's liking. Michael wasn't the kind of guy to get rattled easily, but something about the way he was standing now made Greg's heart skip a beat. Greg, Michael greeted him as he approached, his voice low and steady. We need to talk. Yeah, I know, Greg replied, his eyes scanning the area as he walked with Michael inside. The atmosphere in the dealership felt different, quieter somehow, as though the tension had thickened in the air. I just met with Aaron Caldwell, the guy who represents the investors. He came to offer a partnership or maybe a buyout. I'm not really sure. He didn't explain much. Michael raised an eyebrow. Aaron Caldwell? I've heard of him. He's connected to some big money behind the scenes, people who don't like to play by the rules. If he's sniffing around here, it's not for a friendly chat. He's not someone to trust. Greg ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. I know that now. He was all smooth talk and big promises, but I didn't get a clear answer about what he was offering. He said the future of the business was in their hands now, whatever that means. Michael's expression darkened. I told you something wasn't right. This whole thing, it's moving faster than we can handle. I've been digging around, and there's more to this than just the tech problems. Whoever these investors are, they're trying to create a bigger impact. And we're right in the middle of it. Greg frowned, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. What are you saying? Who are these people, and why are they targeting us? Michael sighed, leaning against the wall for support. It's not just about the dealership, Greg. It's about a lot of smaller businesses like ours that are struggling right now. Big players are swooping in to buy them up, taking advantage of the chaos. They don't care about what happens to the people who've built these businesses. They just want to take control. Greg felt his blood run cold. He had always known the business world could be cutthroat, but this was something else entirely. Someone had targeted his dealership, his life's work, and now it seemed like they were moving in for the kill. We can't let this happen, Greg said, clenching his fists. But we need more information. If these investors are involved in some kind of underhanded strategy, we need to find out exactly who they are and what they're planning. Michael nodded. I agree. I've already reached out to a few people in the industry who might know more about this. But right now, it's a waiting game. We need to stay one step ahead, Greg. We can't get caught off guard. Greg's mind raced. What if Aaron's right? What if we do need that kind of help to keep this place afloat? Michael looked at him, his eyes hard. If you're asking me whether I trust Aaron or his group, the answer is no. These guys don't play fair. They'll take advantage of you, and you'll lose everything. It's better to fight through this on our own, with the people we trust. Greg wasn't sure whether Michael was right, but the thought of losing the dealership, the life he had worked for, was unbearable. He couldn't allow that to happen. Not now. Not after everything he had sacrificed to get to this point. We'll need more help then, Greg said, determination rising within him. We need allies, people who aren't afraid to go up against these investors. We can't do this alone. I agree, Michael replied, his tone softening a bit. We'll find a way, but we need to be smart about this. We can't just go charging in blind. We need to plan carefully, gather intel, and strike when we're ready. Greg nodded, though a knot of anxiety still lingered in his chest. This wasn't just about saving a business. It was about protecting everything he had worked for. The people who depended on him. The community that had supported the dealership for years. The weight of it all was heavy. Just then, Greg's phone buzzed. He pulled it out of his pocket, hoping for some kind of breakthrough. But when he saw the text, his stomach dropped. Meet me. Now. It's worse than you think. They're moving faster than we expected. We need to stop them before they get any closer. The message was from Sarah. The urgency was clear. Greg showed the text to Michael, his jaw tightening. Looks like this just got more complicated. I'll meet you in the office in 10 minutes, Michael said. We can't waste any more time. As Greg walked back toward his office, he felt a rising sense of unease. Whatever was happening, whatever Aaron had hinted at, it was bigger than just the dealership. There were forces at play here that Greg had no control over, and he needed to figure out what they were before it was too late. As Greg stepped into his office, the lights flickered and the phone on his desk rang. He picked it up, his pulse quickening. A voice on the other end was familiar, but it wasn't someone he expected to hear from right now. Greg, the voice said, its tone sharp and filled with tension. It's Michael. You need to listen carefully. This isn't just about you anymore. They're coming after everything. And if you don't act fast, there won't be a dealership left to save. Greg's hand shook as he held the receiver to his ear. Michael's voice had a cold, urgent edge to it that sent a chill down Greg's spine. They're coming after everything, Michael had said. The words reverberated in Greg's mind, amplifying the sense of dread that had been building ever since Aaron Caldwell had walked through the dealership doors. What do you mean, coming after everything? Greg asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was trying to keep it together, but the pieces weren't adding up. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots, but it felt like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. They've already started, Michael continued, his voice strained. The investors aren't just targeting the dealership. They're targeting you. This whole thing, it's about power, control, and they won't stop until they have it. Greg's heart pounded in his chest. He had suspected something was off, but hearing Michael's confirmation felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. He couldn't fathom why they would go after him personally, after his family's legacy, but something told him this wasn't just business. It was personal. I don't understand, Greg said, frustration creeping into his voice. I've been keeping my head down, focusing on getting things back on track. Why would they come after me like this? I wish I could give you a clear answer, Michael replied, but I've seen the way they operate. These investors don't play by the same rules as everyone else. It's not just about making money, it's about power. And they'll take down anyone who stands in their way. Greg exhaled sharply, the weight of the situation sinking in. He had always prided himself on being able to handle adversity, but this was a different beast entirely. His mind was spinning with possibilities, none of them good. I need to meet with Sarah, Greg said, trying to steady his breathing. She's been sending me these urgent messages. Maybe she has more information about what's really going on here. Agreed, Michael replied. But be careful. There's a lot more at play than just the dealership. If they know you're onto them, they'll move faster. We need to stay ahead of them, or we're done. Greg nodded, even though he knew Michael couldn't see him. He felt the tension settle like a weight on his shoulders as he hung up the phone. He had to get to Sarah, and fast. The clock was ticking, and he didn't know how much time he had before the investors made their next move. The drive to Sarah's place was a blur. Greg's thoughts raced as he navigated the streets, but no matter how much he tried to calm his mind, the questions kept piling up. Who were these investors? Why were they targeting him specifically? And what was their ultimate goal? When he finally arrived at Sarah's, he didn't even bother to knock. He just opened the door and walked straight in, finding her sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, eyes wide with concern. "Greg," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she stood to greet him. "You need to hear this." She handed him a folder, thick with papers, and he took it from her without a word. As he opened it, his eyes scanned the documents quickly, each one revealing more troubling information than the last. There were financial records, contracts, and correspondence that all pointed to a single thing. Someone had been watching him for months, gathering information, waiting for the right moment to strike. "I don't understand," Greg said, his voice thick with disbelief. It's like they've been planning this for a while. But why? Why me?" Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "It's bigger than just the dealership, Greg. These investors, they're not just interested in a buyout. They want to take over the entire market. They've been targeting businesses like yours, ones that are struggling, ones with potential but not the resources to fight back." Greg's stomach churned as he absorbed her words. They've been planning this for months? And they've had people inside, watching us? Sarah nodded grimly. "It gets worse. There's something else. The person behind it all. It's not just Aaron Caldwell. He's the front man. The real mastermind is someone else. Someone with deep pockets and a lot of influence. And they won't stop until they control everything." Greg's head spun. Who are they? Who's pulling the strings? Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "I don't know for sure, but I have a strong suspicion. The pattern of investments, the way they've been buying up small businesses, it points to a man named Jonathan Blackwell. He's a shadow figure, but he's been making moves behind the scenes for years. I've heard whispers about him in the industry, but nobody has ever been able to get close enough to confirm it." Greg felt his blood run cold. The name sounded familiar, like a whispered rumor from the past, but he couldn't place it. Whoever Jonathan Blackwell was, he had a plan, and it didn't bode well for Greg's dealership. "Do you think Blackwell is the one pulling the strings with Aaron?" Greg asked, trying to piece it together. "I do," Sarah said, her voice tight. "I think Aaron is just the face. The one who's out there making the deals and handling the public side of things. But Blackwell is the one behind the curtain. He's the one who's been orchestrating all of this." Greg ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "So what now? What do we do about this? How do we stop them?" Sarah's eyes met his, determination flashing in them. "We need to go straight to the source. We need to find out everything we can about Blackwell and his operation. The sooner we get the truth, the better our chances of stopping them." Greg nodded, his resolve hardening. The clock was ticking, and every moment they wasted brought them closer to losing everything. He wasn't about to let that happen. Not on his watch. As Greg stood to leave, his phone buzzed again. The screen lit up with a text from Michael. "They know we're on to them. Aaron's team is coming to the dealership. Prepare for impact." Greg's phone buzzed again, louder this time, and his pulse quickened as he read Michael's urgent message. They know we're on to them. Aaron's team is coming to the dealership. Prepare for impact. His mind raced as he processed the message. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to come together, and with them, the stark reality that things were moving much faster than he had anticipated. They were no longer just fighting for control of a business. They were fighting for their lives. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, but he had no time to second-guess it now. He had to act. He turned to Sarah, who had been watching him intently, waiting for the next move. "They're coming," Greg said, his voice low but resolute. "Aaron's people will be here soon. We have to be ready." Sarah nodded, her expression hardening. "Then we need to make sure they don't get close enough to do any damage. If we're going to stop them, we need to act fast. Do you have a plan?" Greg's mind spun for a moment. The situation was dire, but he knew they couldn't just sit back and wait. If they were going to have any chance of stopping the investors and keeping the dealership, they had to turn the tables. "I have an idea," he said, his eyes narrowing as he took a deep breath. "We're going to get ahead of them. If they think they can walk in and take over without a fight, they've got another thing coming." The dealership was quieter than usual as Greg and Sarah made their way to the office, the calm before the storm hanging in the air. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Greg could feel it building, an undeniable sense of anticipation creeping up his spine. His fingers brushed the door handle, and he paused for a moment to steady himself before walking in. Inside, the atmosphere was even more tense than it had been earlier. Michael had arrived, and his face was grim. He was already on the phone, speaking in low tones, his eyes darting from the door to the phone screen in front of him. "What's the word?" Greg asked as he walked into the office, Sarah close behind. "They're not far," Michael said, hanging up the phone and standing up. "Aaron's team is pulling into the lot as we speak. They'll be in here in the next few minutes. I've got some of my people waiting outside, but we need to stall them. Give us more time to gather information." Greg's chest tightened. He could feel the pressure mounting. This was it, the moment they had been building up to for weeks. There was no turning back now. "Stall them?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. "How are we supposed to do that?" "We don't have a lot of options," Michael replied. "But we can keep them occupied long enough for you and Greg to get into the system, find out where they're coming from, and figure out our next move." Greg glanced at Sarah, and without saying a word, they both knew what they had to do. They had to get inside the dealership's network, dig deeper into the financials, find the connections between Aaron Caldwell and Jonathan Blackwell. There was too much at stake, and if they could uncover the truth, they could stop the takeover before it was too late. "All right," Greg said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "Sarah, you'll help me get into the systems. We'll need full access to everything, emails, financial records, transactions, you name it. Michael, you keep them busy as long as you can. Don't let them get anywhere near us." Michael nodded, his jaw tight. "I've got it covered. Just make sure you're fast." They all knew what was at stake. One wrong move, one slip-up, and it could all be over. The dealership, the life Greg had built, it could all crumble in an instant. The sound of tires crunching over the gravel outside signaled the arrival of Aaron's team. Greg felt the tension coil tighter in his chest. He could hear voices now, low and indistinct, as they approached the front door. He exchanged one last look with Sarah before heading to the computer. He sat down at the desk, typing in a string of passwords, his fingers moving with practiced speed. Behind him, he could hear Michael's voice, steady and calm, as he greeted the visitors at the front. Aaron and his team had arrived. The clock was ticking. Greg focused on the screen in front of him, pulling up the dealership's financial records. He scrolled through the spreadsheets quickly, his eyes scanning for anything that looked out of place. They needed to know how far the investors' influence reached, who they were talking to, and what they had already put in motion. "Got it," Sarah said, her voice breaking through his concentration. "I found the first piece. There's a wire transfer here from a company called Blackwell Holdings. This is Jonathan Blackwell's company." Greg's stomach tightened. "Blackwell Holdings. That's him. The man behind the curtain." Sarah nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "And this transfer, it's not just a regular payment. It's a substantial amount, and it's linked to a group of shell companies. This isn't just a buyout, it's a power grab. Greg felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This was it. They were in too deep now, and the more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Jonathan Blackwell had orchestrated this entire operation from the shadows. He wasn't just interested in the dealership, he was after complete control of the market. "Do you think Aaron knows about this?" Greg asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the storm raging inside of him. "I don't know," Sarah said, her eyes narrowing as she dug deeper into the files. "But if he's working for Blackwell, he has to know. This is bigger than just us, Greg. This is about consolidating power in the entire industry." As they continued to dig through the files, Michael's voice rang out from the front of the dealership, sharp and commanding. "They're here," he said, his tone carrying an urgency that sent a ripple of panic through Greg's body. "They want to speak with you." Greg stood up abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, but there was no time for hesitation. The door to the office was wide open now, and he could hear footsteps approaching. The moment of truth had arrived. Sarah was already at the computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she continued to sift through the financial records. She didn't need to look at Greg to know what was happening. She could feel the tension in the air. They were out of time. "Greg, we need more time," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "We're so close to finding out where they're pulling the strings from. Just a little longer." But Greg could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The footsteps outside were getting closer, and he knew that Aaron's team was already on their way in. They wouldn't wait around for long. "I know," Greg muttered, his jaw set with determination, "but we don't have the luxury of time anymore. We have to face them now. Whatever happens, we need to be ready." He gave Sarah one last look, trying to convey the gravity of the situation. She met his gaze, nodding, and then turned back to the computer, her fingers flying even faster. Before Greg could move toward the door, Michael appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "They're here," Michael said, his voice low and steady. "Aaron's team is already in the showroom. They're ready for you." Greg took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had prepared for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare him for the confrontation that was about to unfold. "We'll need backup," Greg said, his mind racing. "I don't trust Aaron's people, and if we're going to face them, we need to make sure we've got all our bases covered." Michael nodded. "I've got some of my people on standby. If things go sideways, we'll handle it. But you need to keep your cool. They're looking for a fight." Greg gave Michael a terse nod and moved toward the front of the dealership, Sarah quickly following behind him. The heavy silence between them was thick, and Greg's thoughts were a blur as he walked through the dealership, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the otherwise empty space. As he reached the showroom, he saw Aaron standing by the front desk, his arms crossed and a smug smile on his face. Behind him stood three men in business suits, their expressions unreadable. The tension in the air was palpable. "Greg," Aaron said, his voice dripping with fake warmth, "I'm glad we could finally meet face to face. It's been a long time coming." Greg squared his shoulders, refusing to show any sign of weakness. "Cut the small talk, Aaron. We both know why you're here. You think you can just walk in and take everything we've worked for. But you're wrong." Aaron's smile faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "Oh, come on, Greg. It's not personal. This is business. You should know that by now." Greg's jaw tightened. He knew this wasn't just about business. It was about power. And if Aaron thought he could just walk in and take control without a fight, he was gravely mistaken. "I'm not handing over anything," Greg said, his voice steady. "You and your investors might think you can intimidate me into giving up, but that's not going to happen." Aaron's eyes narrowed, the smile completely gone now. "Is that so? Because I think you're out of options. You've been underperforming for months. This place is bleeding money. It's only a matter of time before the bank comes for it." Greg didn't flinch. "You don't know anything about this dealership, about the people who've worked here, about the legacy my family built." "Oh, I know all about your family," Aaron shot back, his voice cold. "And I know about the debts they've racked up over the years. This place isn't worth saving." It's only a matter of time before we take it over. Sarah, who had been standing quietly behind Greg, stepped forward. You don't know what you're talking about, Aaron. We've been digging into your investors. We know who's pulling the strings here. And it's not just you. It's Jonathan Blackwell. At the mention of Blackwell's name, Aaron's face flickered with something. Surprise, perhaps? But it was gone as quickly as it came. He took a step forward, his gaze hardening. You think Blackwell is behind this? Aaron scoffed. You don't know anything. You're out of your depth, Greg. We know more than you think, Greg said, his voice low but filled with confidence. And we're not backing down. If you think you can walk in here and take this dealership without a fight, you're mistaken. Aaron's team behind him shifted, their expressions hardening. Greg could feel the tension in the room escalating, the energy crackling like a live wire. They were on the verge of something big. Aaron stepped forward, his voice dropping to a threatening tone. You really want to do this? You want to fight? Because I can promise you, it won't end well for you. Greg's eyes locked onto Aaron's, unwavering. You might think you're untouchable, but you're not. And you'll learn that the hard way. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence was thick, and the weight of what was about to unfold pressed down on them all. The power struggle that had been simmering for weeks was now out in the open. There was no more pretending. Just as Greg thought Aaron might respond, there was a loud crash from the back of the dealership, followed by shouting. Michael's voice rang out, tense and urgent. It's happening. We've got company. The sound of the crash echoed through the dealership, sending a jolt of adrenaline through Greg's veins. His heart raced as he turned toward the noise, his instinct screaming that something had gone horribly wrong. The tension in the showroom was palpable, thick with the knowledge that this was it. The battle for control was beginning. Stay close, Greg said to Sarah, his voice low but urgent. He motioned for her to follow him as he quickly moved toward the back of the dealership. His eyes locked onto Aaron's, who was now watching him with a mix of amusement and contempt. You can't hide behind your team forever, Greg, Aaron said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The clock is ticking. But Greg didn't respond. He couldn't afford to. He had to figure out what was happening at the back of the dealership, and fast. As Greg and Sarah made their way down the hallway, they could hear more voices, angry shouts, doors slamming open. The noise was chaotic, and the last thing they needed was a full-blown confrontation with Aaron's men. He pushed forward, his mind focused on the goal. There had to be a way to stop this madness. When they reached the back office, Greg stopped short. The door had been kicked open, and two of Aaron's men were standing in the middle of the room, rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces grim. One of them, a tall man with dark hair, turned to Greg and Sarah with a cold smirk. Looks like you've got a little problem on your hands. Greg's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. What's going on here? We've got people in your network, Greg. Your computers, your employees. We've been pulling strings from every angle. You're done, the man said with a twisted smile. Greg clenched his fists. You think you can just waltz in here and take everything? The man's eyes narrowed. You're too late. We've already taken what we need. Your dealership, your future. It's all in our hands now. Before Greg could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps interrupted them. Michael and his team had arrived. Michael wasted no time, pulling out a gun from his jacket and aiming it at the two men. Step away from the computer, Michael commanded, his voice sharp and unyielding. The men froze, but they didn't move. It was clear that a full-on standoff was imminent. Greg glanced at Sarah, who was already moving to the nearby desk, searching for something, anything, that could help them turn the tables. Michael, they're trying to pull everything from the system. We need to cut them off, Greg said, his mind racing. Michael nodded, his eyes never leaving the two men in front of him. I've got your back. Do what you need to do. Sarah found a piece of equipment near the desk, a small server box. She yanked it open, quickly assessing the situation. It didn't take her long to realize that if she could access the system directly from the server, she could lock them out entirely. But she would need a few moments, and every second counted. She turned to Greg. I need you to buy me some time. I can cut them off, but it won't be easy. Greg nodded, his jaw clenched. I've got this. Outside, Aaron's voice rang out, cutting through the chaos. You're wasting your time, Greg. It's over. Just give up already. Greg turned, his face hard with determination. I'm not giving up. Not now. Not ever. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing directly in front of Aaron. The air between them crackled with hostility. This was it. The final confrontation. You think you've won? Greg spat, his voice filled with venom. You think just because you have money, you can take whatever you want? This place means more than that. It's about legacy. It's about what we've built here. Aaron scoffed. You're delusional, Greg. This is how the world works. You can't fight it. Greg shook his head, his fists clenched. You can take this dealership, but you'll never take the heart of it. And that's something you'll never understand. As he spoke, Sarah's fingers flew over the keys, working quickly to break into the system. Every second felt like an eternity. Greg could hear the faint hum of the computers in the background, and he could feel the pressure mounting. Aaron's men were still standing at the back of the room, and Greg knew that a move had to be made, fast. The tension was unbearable as Sarah continued to work, and Greg kept his focus on Aaron. The last thing they could afford now was to show weakness. You're running out of time, Greg, Aaron said, a smug smile playing at the corner of his mouth. We've already won. You're just too stubborn to see it. Greg's response was immediate. I'm not done, and neither are we. Suddenly, there was a loud beep from the desk. Sarah's face lit up with triumph. Got it. I've locked them out. For a moment, Greg felt a rush of relief. They had done it. The key to everything had just been secured. But that relief was short-lived. From the corner of the room, one of Aaron's men stepped forward, pulling a gun from his waistband. The man aimed it directly at Sarah. No one's walking away from this, Greg, the man said, his voice cold as ice. Greg's heart skipped a beat. Everything was falling apart, but he wasn't going to let them take Sarah, or the dealership, without a fight. Greg moved before anyone could react, lunging toward the man with the gun. The chaos erupted all around them. Would Greg make it in time to save Sarah? Would they make it out of this alive? The door slammed open, the force of it shaking the walls, and there stood Aaron, flanked by two of his remaining men. His expression was one of smug satisfaction, a man who thought he had already won. But Greg wasn't going to give him the victory without a fight. You're a stubborn one, Greg, Aaron said, his voice low and mocking. But this ends tonight. No more running, no more hiding behind your little computer system. Greg stood tall, his eyes never leaving Aaron's. You've underestimated me, Aaron. This isn't over yet. Aaron chuckled, taking a step closer. You think you can stop me? You've already lost. The dealership is mine. The systems are under my control, and you have nothing left. Greg's heart raced, his mind working furiously. Aaron was right about one thing. They were out of time. But there had to be a way to turn the tables. He just needed a moment, a small opening, to gain the upper hand. Sarah was still behind him, her breath shallow, but she was keeping her composure. Her mind was running through scenarios, calculating each possible outcome. She had locked Aaron out of the system, but they still weren't out of danger. They needed a way out, and fast. Greg turned slightly, glancing at her. Stay close. We need to move. But before either of them could make a move, Aaron raised his hand, signaling to his men to spread out. One of the men had his gun trained on Greg, while the other was slowly moving toward the computer equipment, eyeing it like a hawk. You can try, Greg, Aaron said, his voice steady, but you've already lost. Your time is up. Greg clenched his jaw, stepping forward, his body tense. I don't lose, Aaron. Without warning, Greg lunged, taking a calculated risk. He moved toward Aaron's men, dodging the gunfire that followed, and in a blur of movement, tackled one of the men to the ground. The gun slipped from the man's hand, skittering across the floor as Greg held him down, using his weight to keep him from moving. Aaron's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of anger. You're making a big mistake. I'm not the one who's making mistakes, Aaron, Greg shot back, his voice cold as he wrestled with the man beneath him. You've been playing all the wrong cards. The remaining henchman aimed his gun at Greg, but before he could pull the trigger, Sarah moved. She was quick, pulling a gun from her bag and firing a single shot. The bullet hit the man's arm, forcing him to drop the weapon in pain. Aaron's eyes widened in shock, the control slipping from his hands. What the hell? Greg took the opportunity, wrenching the man beneath him into a headlock and knocking him unconscious with a well-placed punch. It was a move that left no room for error. Now, with only Aaron to deal with, they could make their escape. But Aaron wasn't backing down. His eyes were wild, filled with rage. You think this is over? You think you've won? This isn't just about the dealership, Greg. This is about power. Greg stood up slowly, his muscles aching from the fight, but his resolve was stronger than ever. You've already lost, Aaron. You just don't know it yet. Aaron's lip curled into a sneer. You think this is over, Greg? It's just beginning. Sarah was already by the door, pulling her phone from her pocket. We need to get out of here. Backup's on the way, but we don't have much time. Greg nodded. Let's go. They both turned toward the exit, but Aaron made one last desperate attempt, pulling a gun from his coat pocket. The sound of the weapon clicking echoed in the room. I won't let you get away, Aaron spat, his hand trembling as he aimed the gun directly at Greg. For a split second, time seemed to slow. Greg could see the fear in Aaron's eyes, but there was also a sense of desperation. Someone who had lost control and was clinging to it for dear life. But before Aaron could pull the trigger, a sharp voice rang out from the hallway. Freeze! A team of police officers burst into the room, guns raised. The sight of them was like a wave crashing over Aaron's confidence. The gun in his hand dropped, his eyes wide in disbelief. You're under arrest, one of the officers said firmly, stepping forward and taking Aaron's gun away. Aaron didn't resist, his shoulders sagging as the weight of his defeat finally set in. The fight was over. As the officers took Aaron and his remaining men into custody, Greg and Sarah stood side by side, their bodies still tense from the chaos that had just unfolded. It was over. Aaron's reign was finished, and the dealership was safe. But the victory didn't come without a cost. Sarah turned to Greg, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. We did it. Greg looked at her, his face a mix of exhaustion and relief. Yeah, we did. But I couldn't have done it without you. They shared a brief, understanding look. They had been through hell together, but they had come out on top. As the police led Aaron away, Greg allowed himself a moment to breathe. The weight of the past few days had been unbearable, and now, for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he could finally exhale. But it wasn't just the battle that had been won. It was the future of the dealership, the legacy they had fought so hard to protect. And with Aaron and his men out of the picture, they could finally rebuild. But as Greg turned to Sarah, ready to face what came next, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat. The message was simple, but its implications were anything but. I'm coming for you next. Will Greg and Sarah be ready for the next battle? And who is A? The message on Greg's phone sent a chill through him, one that settled deep into his bones. He stared at the screen, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the simple yet ominous words. I'm coming for you next. A. Greg muttered under his breath, a frown creasing his brow. Who was A, and why were they targeting him and Sarah now? They'd just survived Aaron's wrath, and now someone new was stepping in. Whoever they weren't wasting any time. Everything okay? Sarah asked, her voice tense but steady as she approached him. Her eyes fell on his phone, and she saw the name on the screen. Greg shook his head slowly. I don't know. I've got a bad feeling about this. He swiped the phone screen, trying to open any clues that might help him understand the message. But there was nothing. The number was unlisted, the message short and cryptic. No trace of who A was or what they wanted. Sarah crossed her arms, studying him carefully. We just took down Aaron and his crew. There's no way we can already be facing someone else. Her voice was laced with disbelief, but she knew better than to assume things would get easier after a win like that. They had just started to rebuild, and someone out there was waiting to tear it all down again. We don't have time to guess who A is, Greg said, his voice firm. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next. The following days felt like a whirlwind. The police had been thorough in their investigation, and Aaron's arrest had brought a temporary sense of relief. The dealership was no longer under threat from the likes of him, but the shadow of a new, more cryptic adversary loomed over them. Greg and Sarah knew they couldn't afford to sit idly by. Their first priority was securing the dealership systems, making sure no one could sneak in under the radar. But their second priority, one that kept them both up at night, was figuring out who he was and what kind of threat they posed. Sarah worked tirelessly to fortify the dealership's security, implementing new measures and double-checking every line of code that ran the system. Greg, meanwhile, took a more direct approach. He started reaching out to his network of old contacts, hoping to find any clue, any shred of information that might shed light on this mysterious figure. It didn't take long before they found something. Greg's old friend, a former investigator who worked with him during the rougher years of his life, had some information on a shadowy figure known as A. "Greg, you're not going to like this," the voice on the phone said, gruff but familiar. It was Marcus, a former colleague from Greg's past. "This is bigger than you think." "What are you talking about?" Greg demanded, his voice rising with concern. "Who is A?" There was a long pause, and Greg could almost hear the hesitation on the other end of the line. Finally, Marcus spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "A is someone you don't want to mess with. They've been behind some of the most dangerous and well-organized operations in the underground business world. They pull the strings from the shadows. No one knows who they really are, but everyone who crosses their path ends up paying the price." Greg's gut tightened. This was no ordinary criminal. What do they want with me? Marcus hesitated again. "They're trying to consolidate power, Greg. They've been eyeing the dealership for a while now, and they've been biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Aaron was just the beginning. Then what? They're not done?" "No, they're far from it," Marcus said. "I don't know all the details, but I've seen the signs. A's next move could be much worse than Aaron. If you're going to survive, you need to be ready." Greg ended the call, his heart pounding in his chest. A was a ghost, a powerful and calculating force with an agenda that remained unclear. But one thing was certain. They weren't just after the dealership, they were after control, and they wouldn't stop until they had it. Greg's mind was racing as he turned to Sarah. "We've got a problem. A is more dangerous than we thought." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "How do we stop someone like that?" "We don't," Greg said, pacing the room. "Not directly, at least. We need to stay one step ahead of them. We need to make them think they've already won. That's the only way we can keep them off balance." Sarah looked at him, uncertain. "So, we wait for them to make a move?" "For now, yes," Greg said. "But we don't sit back and relax. We gather information. We build alliances. And most importantly, we protect what we have, everything we've worked for." Sarah nodded, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "We can't just sit around, Greg. We need a plan, something concrete. This is bigger than just us now." "I know," Greg said. He turned toward the door, ready to start preparing for the unknown. "I'll reach out to Marcus again, see if we can get more intel. But we need to act fast. A isn't going to wait around." In the days that followed, Greg and Sarah worked tirelessly. They fortified the dealership's physical and digital security, making sure every aspect of their operation was as airtight as possible. The work was exhausting, and the constant fear of being watched never left them. It felt as if every corner they turned, every decision they made, was somehow being observed by the unseen hand of A. But as much as they worked, there was no word from Marcus. No new information came their way, and no threats appeared. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. One evening, after another long day of securing the dealership, Greg and Sarah found themselves sitting together in the small break room, sipping coffee in silence. The tension between them was palpable, but neither of them said anything. It wasn't the time for small talk, and they both knew that. Greg glanced at Sarah, his expression softening for a moment. "I don't know what's going to happen next," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Sarah met his gaze. "Neither do I, but we've been through worse. We'll get through this too." The words were simple, but they carried weight. They weren't just fighting for a business anymore. They were fighting for their future. And as much as they tried to prepare for whatever A had in store, they couldn't help but wonder. Were they ready for the storm that was coming? Just as Greg was about to speak again, his phone buzzed with a new message. He glanced at the screen, and his blood ran cold. You're out of time. What is A's next move? Can Greg and Sarah stay ahead of this new threat? The message lingered in Greg's mind as he stared at the screen. The words, "You're out of time," echoed through his thoughts like a drumbeat of impending doom. It was no longer just a shadow in the distance. They were getting closer. And whatever their next move was, it wasn't going to be subtle. Greg ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. He glanced at Sarah, who had been silently observing him, waiting for him to speak. The gravity of the situation was clear between them. "This isn't a threat anymore," Greg said finally, his voice taut with tension. "They're making their move. We need to act now." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What are you thinking?" "I don't know, but I don't plan on waiting around for A to strike first," Greg replied, his voice low but steady. "We can't let them control the narrative. We've got to take the fight to them." Over the next few hours, Greg and Sarah devised a plan, knowing full well it would take everything they had to outmaneuver someone like A. The stakes were higher than ever before, and their every move would be scrutinized by an enemy who wasn't going to let them slip away easily. "I'll start digging into our contacts," Greg said as he sat down at his desk. "I'll reach out to Marcus again, see if he's gotten anything new. We need any intel we can get on A's operations." Sarah nodded, already moving toward the security system. "I'll work on tightening up the dealership's defenses. No more open windows for them to slip through. We can't afford to get complacent now." Greg's mind was racing as he looked at the screen in front of him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but before he could begin, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. The number was unlisted, which only made Greg's heartbeat faster. He answered it immediately, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. "Greg Johnson." A cold, low laugh crackled through the speaker before the voice on the other end replied, "You've been busy, Greg, but you're running out of time." It was A. Greg felt his stomach drop as the realization settled in. This was no longer a game. It was war. "I've been expecting you," Greg said, trying to keep his voice calm, though his pulse quickened. "What do you want?" A's voice was smooth, calculating. "You're still clinging to the false hope that you can stop me, but you've already lost. It's just a matter of when I take what's mine." "I'm not afraid of you," Greg shot back, though he knew the danger wasn't just in the words. The stakes were higher than ever, and A's reach was long. "We'll see how long you last," A said before the call abruptly ended, leaving nothing but the dead air between Greg and Sarah. Greg's knuckles were white from gripping the phone. "We don't have much time, Sarah. We need to get ahead of A, and fast." After the unsettling call, Greg and Sarah agreed they needed to do something bold. They couldn't just sit back and wait for A to strike. They needed to go on the offensive, but they had to be smart about it. A had eyes everywhere. Greg made the decision to send Sarah undercover. She would pose as someone who had inside knowledge of the dealership, someone who was looking to make a deal with whoever A was working with. It wasn't the safest option, but it was their best shot at gathering valuable intel. "I don't like this," Sarah said, her eyes narrowing with concern. "It's too risky." "I know," Greg replied, his voice filled with understanding, "but it's the only way we can make a slip up. If we can get them to reveal their plans, we'll have an advantage." Sarah hesitated, her expression hardening with determination. "All right, but I'm doing this on my terms. I won't let them get too close." Greg nodded, knowing Sarah was tough, but this wasn't just a simple sting. It was dangerous, and they were both walking into the lion's den. He had to trust her, even though the stakes had never been higher. Sarah's first day undercover felt like walking a tightrope. She used the alias Greg had helped her create, a persona designed to get her through the front doors of whoever A was working with. She found herself in a quiet cafe, sipping coffee and waiting for the contact who was supposed to meet her. The weight of her phone pressed against her pocket as she felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her. The door opened, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. He scanned the room briefly before his gaze landed on Sarah. He gave her a small nod, walking toward her with a purposeful stride. "Are you Sarah?" the man asked, his voice clipped. Sarah smiled, giving him a nod in return. "That's me. You're A's contact?" The man leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "We'll discuss that later. For now, let's talk business. He handed her a small envelope before sitting down across from her. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, plans, blueprints for a property that seemed far more valuable than it appeared. Sarah's fingers brushed against the paper, and she instinctively knew that whatever was being plotted here had nothing to do with just a dealership. This was bigger, much bigger. The man across from her leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning her face. You're asking the right questions, but you're not going to find the answers you're looking for. It always wins. Sarah forced herself to smile, her mind spinning with the realization that it was far more organized than they had first believed. This wasn't just about controlling the dealership anymore. It was about something much larger, an empire. Don't be so sure, Sarah replied, keeping her voice even, masking her anxiety. The game's not over yet. The man's lips twitched into a smirk. Oh, it will be. Soon enough. With that, he stood and walked out, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the damning evidence in front of her. She needed to get back to Greg, and fast. The danger was escalating, and they couldn't afford to miss any more steps. As Sarah hurried out of the cafe, her phone buzzed once more. This time, it was another message from the same unlisted number. You've seen the surface. Soon, you'll understand the depth. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she looked around, her eyes scanning the street, feeling as if they were being watched. What is the depth A is referring to, and how far does their influence really reach? Sarah's pulse raced as she looked at the cryptic message from A. You've seen the surface. Soon, you'll understand the depth. A. Her mind swirled with questions. What was it hinting at? What was the depth of their operation? Was she and Greg truly prepared for what lay ahead? She quickly texted Greg, her fingers shaking slightly as she typed, "We need to meet now." Within minutes, Greg responded, his reply concise but urgent, "I'll be there in 20 minutes." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were teetering on the edge of something enormous. A secret so deep that if they weren't careful, they might get swallowed whole by it. They had already seen the surface. What could it possibly mean by the depth? 20 minutes later, Greg arrived at their secret meeting spot, an old, quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Sarah was already seated at a booth, her eyes scanning the room nervously as she waited for him. She couldn't shake the eerie sense that they were being watched, though she couldn't tell by whom. As soon as Greg slid into the booth across from her, Sarah laid out the blueprint she had received earlier. The paper was thin but detailed, showing the plans for a large piece of property on the edge of town. A property that looked, at first glance, like any other abandoned industrial site. But something about it didn't sit right with Sarah. Greg's eyes narrowed as he examined the blueprint. "What are they planning here?" he muttered. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "But this property is huge. And it's not just about real estate. There's something bigger going on. I can feel it." Greg leaned back in the booth, running a hand through his hair. A's always been 2 steps ahead. But now, we might finally be catching up. Sarah looked at Greg, determination in her eyes. "We need to find out what's on that property. Now, whatever A's doing there, it's connected to everything. The dealership, us, all of it." Greg nodded. "We'll go in. We need to be careful, but we can't wait any longer. Let's get eyes on it and see what we're up against." It wasn't long before Sarah and Greg found themselves standing in front of the abandoned property, the cold night air biting at their skin. The place was desolate. Nothing but rusted machinery, crumbling buildings, and overgrown weeds. It looked like a forgotten relic of the past, but Sarah had a feeling that whatever A had planned, it wasn't something that could be left to the decay of time. Greg motioned to a small, rusted door on the side of one of the larger structures. "Let's start there," he whispered. Together, they moved stealthily through the shadows, careful to avoid detection. As they approached the door, Greg pulled out a set of lockpicks, his fingers deftly working to unlock it. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch into the heart of the property. "Stay close," Greg whispered as they ventured inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and oil. Every step they took seemed to echo through the emptiness, their footsteps the only sound in the stillness. The hallway led them to a large, open space, one that resembled a makeshift command center. At first glance, it looked like a place where people would plan something big. Desks were scattered across the room, covered in papers and old files. But it was the large, flickering screen on the far wall that caught their attention. Greg and Sarah crept toward it, their eyes scanning the array of images displayed on the screen. It was a live feed of multiple locations, including the dealership, the property they were standing in, and several other sites, most of which Sarah didn't recognize. "This is bigger than just us," Sarah whispered, her breath catching in her throat. Greg's expression darkened as he realized the truth. "A's been watching us all along. They're orchestrating everything from here." Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the room. Greg and Sarah whipped around, their hearts racing. A shadowed figure stepped into the doorway, a smirk on their face. "So, you finally decided to take a peek behind the curtain," the voice said, smooth and cold. It was A. Sarah and Greg stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation crashing down on them. A was here. The person they had been hunting for weeks, the puppet master pulling the strings, was now standing before them. "You've come all this way to stop me?" they asked, their voice dripping with amusement. "You should have known better." Greg's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. "We're not backing down. Whatever you're planning, it ends tonight." A's smile widened. "How quaint. You really think you can stop me? You've seen the surface, but you have no idea what's coming next." Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp. "We've seen enough. Whatever you're doing here, we're taking you down." A raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. "You really believe that? You're just pawns in a much larger game. You've been too focused on the wrong things. The dealership? That's just a small part of it. The real power lies in what's coming, and you can't stop it." Before Greg or Sarah could respond, A made a quick motion, and the room seemed to shift. Suddenly, multiple figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding them. They were outnumbered, but they weren't backing down. "This is your last chance," as said, their voice cold. "Walk away, and I might let you live. Stay, and you'll regret it." Greg's eyes locked with Sarah's, the unspoken message clear. They weren't walking away. "No," Greg said firmly. "We're not leaving without you." A let out a soft, almost pitying laugh. "Then so be it." The figures around them advanced, but before they could make a move, Sarah launched herself forward, tackling one of the figures to the ground. Greg followed suit, his fists flying as he fought off the attackers. In the chaos of the fight, Greg caught a glimpse of a retreating toward the far side of the room, heading for a hidden exit. Without thinking, he broke away from the fray, rushing toward them. "You're not getting away," Greg shouted as he closed the distance between them. A turned, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something almost human in their eyes, fear. They tried to make a run for it, but Greg was too fast. He tackled them to the ground, pinning them down with all his strength. "You don't get to run," Greg spat, his voice filled with fury. "It's over." As Greg struggled to keep it down, he could hear Sarah shouting behind him. He turned just in time to see her collapse, surrounded by several of A's men. In that moment, everything seemed to freeze, the world hanging in the balance. The sun had barely begun to rise when Greg and Sarah reached a safe house, the location secured by an old friend who had ties with local law enforcement. As they entered the modest, dimly lit room, the weight of the past few days seemed to settle on them like a heavy cloak. Their muscles ached from the constant tension, their minds still racing from everything they had uncovered. The storm was far from over, but at least, for the moment, they were safe. Greg sat down heavily on the worn couch, his eyes fixed on the message he had received on his phone just moments before they arrived at the safe house. It was from A. The chilling words lingered in his mind, replaying over and over again. "You've only scratched the surface. A. What do you think they mean by that?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence as she sat down next to him. Greg ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of the cryptic message. "I don't know, but I have a feeling they're not done with us yet. If they had the power to manipulate everything we've seen so far, they're capable of much more than we thought." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "But why us? Why get so involved in our lives? We've only been trying to stop them from taking over the dealership. What's their endgame? Greg shook his head, frustration mounting. I don't know. It's like we're just pawns in a much larger game. Every time we think we've uncovered the truth, another layer gets peeled back, and it only leads to more questions. It had been days since they had been confronted by A, but the events still haunted Greg's thoughts. A's words echoed in his mind. You've been following breadcrumbs, thinking they'd lead you somewhere, but you've been walking right into my trap. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. From the very beginning, they had been one step behind. It wasn't just about the dealership. That was merely a distraction. A had orchestrated everything to keep them focused on the wrong things. The real plan lay beneath the surface, hidden from view. Greg stared out the window, deep in thought. Sarah had stepped into the kitchen, preparing a cup of coffee. The silence between them spoke volumes. They were both exhausted, physically and emotionally drained from the chaos. But the question still loomed in Greg's mind. What was A's endgame? He had a feeling they were getting close to finding out. The sudden ring of Greg's phone startled him. He picked it up, half expecting it to be another cryptic message from A. Or worse, more threats. To his surprise, it was Jack, the old friend who had helped them find the safe house. Greg, I've got some information for you, Jack said, his voice low and urgent. You're not going to like it. Greg's heart skipped a beat. What's going on? Jack paused before speaking again, as if weighing his words carefully. I've been digging into A's past. They've been active in this city for years, and I've traced their activities to some old files. The dealership, the property you were at, they're just a small part of a much larger operation. And it's tied to something much bigger. Greg sat up straight, his attention now fully on the phone. What do you mean, something bigger? There's a company, one that has been flying under the radar for a while. It's called Apex Industries. I don't have all the details yet, but they're connected to A. And from what I can tell, they've been using your dealership and several other fronts to funnel resources into a secret project. Apex Industries? Greg repeated, the name unfamiliar. What's the project? Jack's voice lowered even further. I don't know yet, but I'm digging. I'll keep you updated. Before Greg could respond, Jack hung up. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. Apex Industries. It was the first real lead they'd had in days. But just how deep did A's web go? Greg turned to Sarah, who had just finished preparing her coffee and was sitting across from him. Her eyes were tired, but there was a spark of determination still lingering in them. You heard that? Greg asked, his voice tight with urgency. Sarah nodded, her brow furrowing. Apex Industries. It sounds familiar. I think I've heard rumors about them before, but I never knew they were tied to A. Greg sighed. I didn't either. But it makes sense. If A's been pulling the strings all along, using the dealership as a cover for something bigger, then Apex is probably at the center of it. Sarah stood up, pacing the room as she thought. But why Apex? What is it about this company that's so important to A? And how do they tie into the larger operation? Greg ran a hand through his stubble, his mind working overtime. I don't know. But whatever it is, it's the key to everything. We need to find out more about Apex, figure out what they're really doing. Sarah stopped pacing and turned toward him, a determined look in her eyes. Then let's get to work. We're not going to stop until we have all the answers. The hours slipped away as Greg and Sarah worked together to piece together the puzzle. Using the information Jack had provided, they managed to dig deeper into Apex Industries, uncovering a trail of shady business dealings, secret accounts, and connections to powerful people who operated in the shadows. But there was one thing they couldn't find, any solid evidence that would link A to Apex. Every lead they followed seemed to end in dead ends. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase any trace of their involvement. Greg slammed his fist on the desk in frustration. It's like they've covered their tracks so well that we can't find anything concrete. What are we missing? Sarah sat down beside him, her face tense. Maybe it's not about finding the evidence. Maybe we need to go straight to the source. Greg looked at her, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? I think it's time we went to the heart of Apex Industries. We have to confront them directly. Greg hesitated. He knew the risks. If they went to Apex's headquarters without enough intel, they could walk right into a trap. But at this point, they didn't have many options left. It was time to face the enemy head-on. "All right," Greg said, his voice steely. "We're going in." Greg grabbed his jacket, the weight of the decision pressing on him. Sarah followed suit, grabbing her bag and preparing for whatever was coming next. The endgame was near. But with every step, they both knew it was going to be the fight of their lives. They weren't just going up against A anymore. They were going up against a powerful, unseen force. Apex Industries wasn't just a company. It was a network of power, corruption, and manipulation that had its tendrils in every corner of the city. But Greg and Sarah had come this far. They weren't going to stop now. The hum of the city around them seemed distant, muffled by the pounding of Greg's heart. Every step they took toward Apex Industries' headquarters felt heavier, more deliberate. The sun had set hours ago, and the streets were bathed in a dim glow from the streetlights. The night was alive with motion, but for Greg and Sarah, it felt like they were walking in the eye of a storm, where everything was still, yet the danger was palpable. Greg's mind raced as they neared the towering building. This was it. They were stepping into the heart of the beast. The stakes had never been higher. His hand tightened around the strap of his bag, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of a gun he had hidden inside. They weren't going in unarmed. Not this time. "We need to stay sharp," Greg said quietly, his voice low enough that only Sarah could hear. "We don't know who's waiting for us inside. A has eyes everywhere." Sarah nodded, her jaw clenched, but her eyes were steady. "I've got your back," she replied, her voice firm. "We're getting the answers we need." The door to the building loomed ahead. A sleek, modern structure. It seemed almost sterile, its glass exterior reflecting the streetlights in a way that gave it an eerie, impersonal quality. There was no sign of life at the entrance, no security guards or anyone to challenge them. It was as if Apex Industries had anticipated their arrival, preparing for it in a way that sent a chill down Greg's spine. "You ready?" Greg asked, his breath catching in his throat. Sarah gave him a small, determined smile. "Let's do this." They stepped into the lobby, the door closing softly behind them. The space was pristine, almost too perfect, polished floors, high ceilings, and the faint scent of antiseptic in the air. It felt like they had walked into an environment where nothing was allowed to be out of place, an environment designed to make anyone who entered feel insignificant, small. There was no receptionist, no waiting area, just sleek, impersonal walls lined with abstract art that looked as though it had been chosen to confuse and unsettle rather than inspire. "Something's off," Sarah muttered under her breath as they moved further in. Greg agreed. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense that they were being watched, even though there was no one around. His instincts told him they were already being tracked. But by who? And how? Before he could voice his concerns, a voice suddenly echoed from a speaker above them, making both of them freeze. "Welcome, Mr. Greg Mason, Ms. Sarah Collins. We've been expecting you." The voice was calm, unsettlingly polite, as though the speaker knew them intimately, which only made Greg feel more exposed. A smile crept onto his face, but it was strained. "So, A's been keeping an eye on us," he murmured to Sarah. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her hand subtly brushing against the holster at her side. "It's not just A. Someone else is pulling the strings here, and they're watching us." As if on cue, the elevator doors on the far side of the lobby opened with a soft chime. A woman in a sharp business suit stood inside, her eyes cool and assessing. She was tall, with platinum blonde hair cut into a sleek bob. Her gaze flicked over them, as though assessing their worth before she spoke. "Follow me," she said, her tone clipped but not unkind. "I'll take you to where your questions can be answered. All of them." The elevator ride was silent, the soft hum of the machinery almost too loud in the confined space. Greg's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. They had walked straight into the enemy's lair, and yet there was a strange calm to everything. They were expected. That couldn't be good. When the elevator finally stopped, the woman led them down a sterile, brightly lit hallway. At the end of the hall was a set of large double doors, their polished wood gleaming like they had been carved from the finest oak. "This is where you'll get the answers you seek," the woman said as she stopped in front of the doors and pressed her hand against the biometric scanner beside them. There was a soft beep, and the doors slowly opened. Inside was a large, elegant office, its floor-to-ceiling windows providing a stunning view of the city below. But what struck Greg most was the man sitting behind the large, dark-wood desk. His posture was perfect, his tailored suit impeccable, but it wasn't his appearance that drew Greg's attention. It was the calmness in his eyes, the kind of calmness that only someone with immense power could have. The man stood as they entered, extending his hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Mason, Ms. Collins, it's a pleasure to finally meet you." Greg's gaze locked with his. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately, his eyes flicking to Sarah before he took his seat again. "You don't recognize me?" He let the question hang in the air, his smile widening. "I'm afraid we've never met in person, but I've been following your progress for some time now. You're quite the resourceful pair." Greg felt a chill spread through him. This man was connected to everything, the dealership, Apex Industries. He could feel it in his gut. "Who the hell are you?" Greg demanded, his voice a bit more forceful this time. The man finally leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk as he spoke. "I'm someone who has been building something larger than you can imagine. For all their talents, has never been the mastermind behind it. I am." Greg's eyes widened as he took in the implication. This was the true power behind the operation. This was the person who had been manipulating all along. "You're the one pulling the strings," Greg said, realization dawning. "You've been orchestrating everything." The man smiled again, but this time, there was something colder in it. "That's correct. Apex Industries is my creation. It was useful, but not anymore. You've become an obstacle, Mr. Mason, and so has Ms. Collins. You're no longer needed." Before Greg could react, the doors behind them slammed shut with a heavy thud, and the woman who had escorted them and stood by the door, her arms folded. She wasn't just an assistant. She was part of this, a part of the web that had been spinning around them without their knowledge. "Why? What's the endgame?" Sarah demanded, her voice sharp. "You've taken everything from us. All the lies, the manipulation. For what?" The man behind the desk leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he studied them. "Power, Ms. Collins. Control. You're not just pawns. You're catalysts for the next stage. I need you to understand one thing. This was never just about the dealership. It was never just about It's about reshaping everything. We are going to change the system." The realization hit Greg like a ton of bricks. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about just taking over businesses. It was about something much deeper, control over the very fabric of society, reshaping power dynamics, and influencing every corner of the city. Before Greg could formulate a response, the man's eyes glinted with cold satisfaction. "Welcome to the New World Order, Mr. Mason, Ms. Collins. I hope you enjoy your stay." Greg's heart raced, the weight of the truth settling over him like a storm cloud. They were trapped. The mastermind behind everything was finally revealed. But this was far from over. The battle was only just beginning, and it was clear that they had just walked into a much larger war than they had ever anticipated. What would they do now? What choices lay ahead? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was clear. They were in the lion's den, and escape was no longer an option. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?